Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of our story. If you like this What If story and want to see part 2, let me know in the comments below. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Also, check the description for more great content and my playlist. This story was posted by 𝐼𝐼𝐻𝐼𝐻𝐼𝐻 on Wattpad. Now let's start. Night had fallen quickly over the land. Just an hour ago, the sky had been painted with hues of red, orange, and pink, but now all color had faded, leaving only a matte black canvas with no stars to be seen. The green-haired boy gazed out the window, watching as frost slowly covered its surface. It made him shiver. He had always wanted to go outside. It was an unknown place to him. He wasn't allowed to leave the house, so instead, he would watch the world from the window. Izuku's father called for him, asking for a beer. He glanced at his father before wandering over to the fridge. He opened it and looked up at the alcohol, which was too high for him to reach. At only 4 years old, he felt the absence of a mother had made him grow slower, perhaps because he rarely had nutritious meals. He stood as tall as he could, but still couldn't reach. Instead, he focused intently on the bottle until it began to float, slowly making its way into his hands. With a deep sigh, he made his way back to his father, holding up the beer with a smile. His father took it and ruffled his curly hair. Midoriya climbed onto the couch and stared back out at the frost-covered window. His dad had a tendency to drink, which sometimes led to his bruises and scars. But he didn't know anything different, he was just a child. As the evening progressed and more beers were consumed, the atmosphere shifted, and Izuku braced himself for the least favorite part of the day, the part where he would get hurt. Suddenly, a hand gripped the small boy's neck, and he was thrown onto the floor. His father, filled with anger, questioned why Izuku had to resemble his mother so much. Flames flickered in his eyes, and Izuku hoped he wouldn't unleash his quirk, but he did. Fire erupted, singeing the boy's clothes and causing pain to his shoulder and part of his chest. Izuku let out a cry, and his father froze, panic washing over him. He hurriedly tore away the boy's burning clothes and rushed him to the bathroom. He placed Izuku under the cold shower, and the boy cried, his body tense with fear. The cold water soothed the burns, which were now red and painful. His father kept him in the shower for 20 minutes before turning off the water. "Dry yourself off. I'll be back," his father instructed. Izuku stepped out of the shower, reaching for a towel. He dried himself as best he could with his sore shoulder and pulled on his shorts. Hisashi returned with bandages, carefully wrapping them around his son's injured body. When he finished, Izuku hugged him tightly, mumbling an apology. His father's eyes widened. His son rarely spoke. He picked Izuku up and carried him to the lounge room. "I'll go get some ice cream," he said, placing Izuku on the sofa before walking away. The boy sank into the comforting cushions, feeling a flicker of happiness at the thought of ice cream, which he didn't get to have often. His father returned with a small bowl of chocolate ice cream, and Izuku happily dug in, finding that his burns didn't hurt as much anymore. His father could be nice. During the day, or when he wasn't drinking, he didn't hurt him. He didn't talk much either, just fed him, sent him to bed, and locked him up during the day while he worked. When he drank, his pent-up emotions would explode, and he would take his pain out on Izuku, the child born when the love of his life had passed away. "Bedtime," his father announced. Izuku nodded and slid off the couch, walking with his father to his bedroom, which was bare. There was a futon on the floor and a single teddy bear sitting on it. He crawled into his futon while his dad closed the door and locked it. As much as he wanted to sleep, pain coursed through his shoulder. He managed to sneak in a few winks of sleep, but most of the night was spent tossing and turning, accompanied by quiet cries of discomfort. When his father woke up, he took Izuku into the lounge room. "I'll be back at 7, he said, sitting Izuku on the couch. He picked up a small ankle chain from the floor and clicked it onto the boy's ankle before leaving the house. Izuku wanted to remind him that he had forgotten breakfast, but his father was already gone. He glanced at the chain attached to his ankle, knowing he wouldn't be able to reach the fridge. Instead, he turned on the TV and watched the news, which often featured heroes defeating villains. The heroes fascinated him, and he longed to be like them. However, his father had told him he wasn't allowed to be a hero. He said that murderers were villains, and since he had caused his mother's death at 𝐼𝐼𝐻, he couldn't be a hero. Izuku didn't understand what he had done wrong. She had simply died while giving 𝐼𝐼𝐻. He watched TV for a few hours before dozing off. He was awakened when his father returned home. "Were you a good boy?" his father asked, and Izuku nodded. "I need to use the bathroom, please," he mumbled. His father unlocked the ankle chain, and Izuku hurried to the bathroom. Hisashi set a bag of takeout on the bench and got out cutlery. When Izuku returned, they ate dinner together. His father had a few beers with his meal, which made Izuku uneasy. He hoped he wouldn't get hurt that night. After dinner, they sat on the couch. Izuku read a book happily while his father watched a reality show, drinking beers. As the night wore on and the beers piled up, Izuku grew nervous but dared not draw attention to himself. Instead, he gazed out the window at the dark night sky, watching as frost slowly covered the glass once more. "Hey, brat," his father growled, and Izuku glanced at him with concern. "Why were you born? Why do you have to look so much like her?" he snapped. Izuku looked away, knowing his father was referring to his mother. Though he had never met her, he felt a sense of guilt. "Sometimes I just want to rip all your hair out, one by one," his father yelled. "You know what's the worst? You inherited her quirk. A useless child like you. You have no right to use her quirk," he continued, and Izuku flinched at the harshness of his father's words. All one had to do was focus on something, anything. Then inspiration would strike. Hisashi reflected on how much mental strength his mother had to exert when using her quirk, and he couldn't help but feel frustrated that Midoriya made it seem so effortless. In a fit of anger, he hurled his empty bottle at the wall, shattering it into pieces. Hisashi's voice dripped with contempt as he glared at Midoriya, whose emerald eyes mirrored those of his mother, 𝐒𝐮𝐬, the love of his life. He thought about how Midoriya had caused her so much pain. In a moment of rage, he threatened to take away what made Midoriya special, believing it might somehow redeem him in his mother's eyes. Rising from his seat, he made his way to the kitchen, retrieving a sharp knife from the drawer and approaching Midoriya slowly. Midoriya's heart raced with fear as he covered his eyes with his small hands, trying to shield himself from the impending threat. Hisashi's voice was harsh as he demanded Midoriya to stop acting like a child. With a swift motion, he yanked one of Midoriya's arms away from his face, making a quick slash with the knife. Midoriya cried out in distress, pushing his father away and darting down the hallway, tears streaming down his face. Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting the chaos. A voice from outside called out, announcing the arrival of the police due to complaints of yelling. Hisashi, panicked, grabbed Midoriya and shoved him into a room, signaling him to be quiet. He cautiously opened the front door to face the officers. The policemen entered, surveying the scene. They immediately noticed Hisashi's disheveled state and the signs of his drinking. As one officer questioned him, a faint voice echoed from down the hallway, pleading for help. The officers exchanged concerned glances and moved toward the sound. Inside the dark room, they found Midoriya huddled in the corner, clutching his eye, which was already showing signs of distress. He begged for his father not to harm him further. The urgency of the situation escalated as one officer shouted for assistance, demanding that Hisashi be arrested and an ambulance called. Hisashi's anger flared as he was taken away, leaving Midoriya in the care of the police. One officer knelt beside Midoriya, offering reassurance. As Midoriya cautiously uncovered his eyes, the officer smiled gently and handed him a clean cloth, instructing him to apply pressure to his injury. Midoriya, intrigued by this kind stranger, followed the advice. As the officer lifted Midoriya and carried him out of the apartment, the little boy expressed his reluctance to go outside. The officer, confused but friendly, assured him that it was okay. Stepping into the fresh air, Midoriya was overwhelmed by the sensations, the wind in his hair, the earthy scent after rain. It felt surreal. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics carefully took Midoriya inside. He reached out for his father, who was being taken away in a police car, trembling with uncertainty. The paramedics tried to engage him in light conversation, asking about his favorite color and animal, but all he wanted was his dad. The doors closed, and the ambulance sped away. Midoriya felt dizzy, the pressure on his eye failing to stop the flow of blood. A paramedic sat beside him, helping him hold a fresh gauze against his injury. Midoriya's panic rose as he asked about his father, but the paramedic reassured him that everything would be all right. Upon arriving at the hospital, Midoriya was wheeled inside on a stretcher. He was taken into emergency surgery, but despite their best efforts, they couldn't save the vision in his eye. When he finally woke up, he found himself in a hospital room, feeling numb and disoriented. For lines connected to his hand, and unfamiliar machines beeped around him, creating a sterile atmosphere. As he surveyed the room, he noticed the curtains surrounding his bed and the bandages covering his arms, concealing the marks left by his father. He gingerly touched the bandage over his injured eye, feeling the remnants of what had happened. A nurse entered, sliding the curtain aside as she checked her clipboard. She greeted him with a warm smile, introducing herself as 𝐼𝐻𝐬. Surprised to see him awake, she asked how he was feeling. Midoriya quietly inquired about his father, but the nurse could only respond that she wasn't sure where he was. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 took a seat beside the bed and began asking Midoriya questions. He confirmed his name and age, holding up 4 fingers proudly. The nurse noted his responses, commenting on how he was growing up. When she asked about his quirk, Midoriya mentioned that he had inherited his mother's ability, feeling a pang of guilt for what had happened. As they talked, Midoriya's quirk manifested unexpectedly, causing the clipboard to glow and fly into his hands. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 praised him for his control, and for a moment, Midoriya felt a sense of pride. They continued their conversation about his life and experiences, but as the night wore on, 𝐻𝐻𝐬 decided it was best for him to get some rest, closing the curtains to give him privacy. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 let him go to sleep and closed his curtains. The next day, Midoriya sat in front of a TV in the children's patient area. A few other kids played with toys, some had broken bones, while others were unwell. Midoriya was fascinated by all the children his age. A boy sat down next to him, staring intently at the TV. Midoriya glanced at him and noticed a bandage covering one of his eyes. His hair was half red and half white, which looked impressive. The boy noticed Midoriya's gaze and turned to him, commenting on the bandage over his own eye. Midoriya nodded in agreement. The boy introduced himself as Todoroki Shoto and extended his hand, suggesting they become friends. Midoriya hesitated for a moment, recalling the movies where people shook hands to become acquainted. He shook Todoroki's hand and offered a charming smile, introducing himself quietly as Midoriya Izuku. They both watched the TV together for a while, like emotionless dolls. Neither of them laughed at the funny parts of the cartoon. Midoriya sat quietly with a small grin, while Todoroki appeared dazed. A voice called out to Midoriya, and he turned to see his nurse, 𝐻𝐻𝐬. She asked him to come with her, and he waved goodbye to Todoroki as he left with the nurse. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 informed him that his new foster parents had come to meet him. Midoriya nodded, and they walked into his shared hospital room, where a young couple stood by his bed. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 encouraged him to say hello. Midoriya looked up at the couple and mumbled a greeting. The lady smiled warmly and introduced herself as Anae, while her husband, Naoki, waved at Midoriya. He managed a small smile before hiding behind the nurse. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 chuckled, noting that Midoriya seemed a little shy, to which Anae commented on his cuteness. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 knelt beside Midoriya and asked if he needed help changing or could do it alone. Midoriya confidently replied that he could manage, tilting his head slightly. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 handed him some neatly folded clothes, and before he could say anything else, Midoriya dashed off to the bathroom. After standing up, 𝐻𝐻𝐬 explained to the couple that Midoriya had a box of belongings from home that the police had found. He mentioned the medication that could be taken with food and a cream for a burn on Midoriya's shoulder that needed to be applied daily until it was finished. Anae asked if they would bring him back in a week to have his stitches removed. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 reassured her that the stitches were dissolvable and would disappear on their own with time. Midoriya returned from the bathroom, now dressed in a short-sleeve white shirt and denim shorts. 𝐻𝐻𝐬 smiled, telling him that his discharge papers had been signed, and he was free to go. Midoriya looked up at his foster parents, who smiled kindly at him. Naoki picked up a box full of Midoriya's things, while Anae gathered his medication, and together they left the hospital. During the car ride to his new home, Midoriya gazed out the window, captivated by the scenery. The car pulled into the driveway of a small two-story house. 𝐼𝐚𝐬 opened the door for Midoriya, who carefully slipped out of the seat and onto the ground. 𝐼𝐚𝐬 unlocked the door and held it open for Midoriya and Naoki. Midoriya cautiously looked around the house. Naoki offered to show him his bedroom and led him down a small hallway to open a door. Midoriya peeked inside to find a bed in the corner, a little desk, and a wardrobe. Naoki set the box of Midoriya's belongings down. He asked if Midoriya wanted to go through the box, and Midoriya nodded, lifting the lid to peer inside. He found a picture of his mother and father in a frame and giggled, saying that his mother was pretty. However, his expression shifted as he recalled a painful memory, admitting that he felt he was a naughty boy for what had happened to her. Naoki gently patted Midoriya's green hair, reassuring him that it wasn't his fault and that his mother had passed due to complications. During BNHA, Midoriya remained silent for a moment, confused by the conflicting messages he had received throughout his life, but he shrugged it off. Naoki placed the picture on the desk while Midoriya sorted through his clothes. At the bottom of the box, he found his little teddy bear and hugged it tightly. Naoki suggested they go watch TV, and they left Midoriya's bedroom for the lounge room. Midoriya set his teddy down and followed Naoki. They watched TV for a while 𝐼𝐚𝐬 prepared dinner. Midoriya often gazed out the window, watching butterflies flutter around the flowers in the garden. He glanced back inside and began studying the house, noticing a bookshelf filled with books. Curious, he looked up at Naoki and asked if he could read. Naoki responded affirmatively, though he warned that the books might be a bit difficult. Midoriya approached the bookshelf, pulled out a biology book, and examined the cover featuring a DNA molecule and cells. He sat down on the floor and began to read through the book. Naoki observed him, wondering if Midoriya was merely looking at the pictures. He asked if Midoriya could read the text, and Midoriya nodded. Naoki then requested that he come read it to him. Midoriya climbed onto the sofa, opening the book on his lap and reading aloud about scientific understanding and the collaboration and competition among scientists. Naoki expressed his admiration for Midoriya's reading skills, and Midoriya shared that his father would bring him books to read while he worked. 𝐼𝐚𝐬 called them for dinner, prompting Naoki to stand up and ask Midoriya to leave the book behind. Midoriya set the book down and followed Naoki into the kitchen. They all sat down to eat, and Midoriya savored the home-cooked meal, having never experienced anything like it before. He happily finished his plate. After dinner, they offered him a small cup containing pink liquid and asked if he could take his medicine. Midoriya nodded and gulped it down. 𝐼𝐚𝐬 praised him and offered to help him take a bath. Though he felt reluctant, he agreed and hopped off his seat, not wanting to protest. He followed her to the bathroom, where she prepared the bath. She asked if he needed help getting undressed. Midoriya shook his head and carefully took off his shirt, mindful of his burns. She assisted him in removing the bandages from his injuries, revealing a large patch over his eye, secured with medical tape. She helped him wash his hair while avoiding his eye and was extra cautious with his burn. Afterward, she dried him off, applied a special cream to his burn, though he pretended it didn't hurt, wrapped his injuries, and helped him change into his pajamas. He felt a sense of comfort. He had never had someone care for him during his moments of pain or illness. She tucked him into bed with his teddy bear, whispering for him to rest easy and to call for her if he felt any discomfort. She left the door open, allowing a soft light to guide him, and he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Midoriya had been with his new family for a few weeks, still adjusting to their love and care. Naoki and 𝐼𝐚𝐬 ran a business together, and he often overheard their discussions about financial stress and intimidating higher-ups. While Naoki worked, Midoriya spent his days with 𝐼𝐚𝐬 instead of being cooped up with books and the television. They would venture outside, exploring parks and enjoying nature, which he loved. 𝐼𝐚𝐬 noticed that Midoriya struggled to make his own decisions, always obeying without complaint. During dinner, he often gazed out into the darkness, fidgeting nervously as if something frightened him. One day, they strolled through a small wildlife park, hand in hand. Midoriya admired the colorful flowers and watched the ducks swim. They enjoyed ice cream together while sitting on a bench. 𝐼𝐚𝐬 asked if he was excited to start school soon. Midoriya looked up at her, his eyes filled with hope, and quietly asked if he could really go to school. She assured him he could, and he smiled brightly, though he hesitated, recalling his father's words that he was a bad boy unworthy of school. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 gently reassured him that he was a good boy and that his father was mistaken. Midoriya's smile returned, and he felt a surge of happiness. After their outing, they returned home, where Midoriya read more books while 𝐼𝐻𝐬 prepared snacks. She asked if he wanted to remove the bandage from his eye, and he was surprised to learn he could. As he carefully unraveled the bandage, he discovered that the stitches had fallen out, leaving only a thin pink scar. When 𝐼𝐻𝐬 asked if he could open his eye, he shook his head, and she smiled, reassuring him that it was okay. Midoriya hesitantly mentioned that he feared she might take his eye away. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐵, concerned, comforted him with a warm hug, assuring him that those fears were unfounded. He explained that voices told him she would hurt him, and she expressed her concern for his well-being. Just then, Naoki came home, and Midoriya greeted him with a bright smile, excited to show off that he had removed his bandage. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 shared her worries about the voices Midoriya heard, and Naoki suggested they might need to take him somewhere for help. They decided to see how he adjusted to school first. Naoki expressed his concerns about their business and the potential danger from their bosses, but 𝐼𝐻𝐬 remained hopeful that they would be safe. The day of school arrived quickly. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 helped Midoriya dress nicely and asked if he was excited to make friends. He nodded enthusiastically. She gently brushed his hair and listened as he mentioned discomfort when using his quirk. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 advised him not to use it until they could see a doctor. As they walked to school, Midoriya clung to his bag, excitement bubbling within him. They arrived at a small school, and 𝐼𝐻𝐬 guided him through the welcoming gates to his classroom. She promised to meet him after school, reminding him to be a good boy. Inside the classroom, Midoriya was thrilled to see other children. The teacher welcomed him and asked for his name. He shyly introduced himself, and she helped him find his shelf among the others. When the bell rang, the teacher gathered everyone in a circle to introduce themselves. Midoriya sat next to her, ready to share his story. Midoriya Izuku quietly expressed his love for reading. The teacher smiled and engaged the class in a discussion about school, but Midoriya felt a sense of discomfort. They spent most of the morning playing games to get to know each other, yet Midoriya struggled to make friends. When lunch arrived, everyone gathered to eat together. After lunch, the children ran off to play, and Midoriya approached his teacher with a hint of nervousness. He asked if there were any books available. The teacher pointed to a bookshelf, mentioning that the books might be a bit challenging to read. She walked with him to the shelf, where Midoriya pulled out a picture book about a fish that traveled the ocean. As he flipped through the pages, he quickly read the story and wondered why the fish could talk and why the shark didn't eat it. The teacher explained that the fish was expressing its thoughts and that the shark was a friend, not a predator. Midoriya, surprised by his own knowledge, mumbled about marine animals instinctively avoiding predators. The teacher, impressed, asked if he would like to visit the library to find a different book. Eagerly, Midoriya nodded, and they made their way to the school library, where she helped him select a novel. He began reading as they walked back to the classroom. While Ms. Naomi interacted with other students, Midoriya settled down to read. Suddenly, a boy with spiky blonde hair loomed over him, calling him a nerd. Midoriya shrugged in response. The boy snatched the book from Midoriya's hands, and instead of trying to retrieve it, Midoriya simply asked if the boy wanted to read it. The boy scoffed, dismissing the idea of reading like a nerd. Midoriya flinched at the boy's loud tone. Ms. Naomi approached the two boys, firmly instructing the blonde to return the book. The boy refused, and Midoriya, feeling protective, jumped in front of him, pleading for the teacher not to punish him. He trembled, having never witnessed someone defy an adult before. The teacher, taken aback, calmly assured Midoriya that she would never hurt anyone. Midoriya, still trembling, explained that disobedience was considered wrong at home. The teacher gently inquired if someone at home hurt him. Midoriya hesitantly revealed that his father had hit him but had been arrested. The teacher apologized, assuring him that she would never harm him or anyone else. Midoriya, feeling reassured, smiled and removed his hands from his face. As the day came to an end, Midoriya walked home with 𝐼𝐻𝐬. They prepared dinner together while waiting for Naoki to return from work. When 𝐒𝐮𝐽 arrived, he appeared distressed and urgently instructed 𝐼𝐻 to hide with Midoriya. 𝐼𝐻, panicking, expressed her fear of the men from a rival company. 𝐒𝐮𝐽 reassured her, promising to do his best to handle the situation. Midoriya sensed the tension and asked what was happening. 𝐒𝐽, smiling softly, encouraged him to stay strong. When the doorbell rang, 𝐼𝐻 quickly helped Midoriya hide under the bed, handing him his teddy bear and instructing him to remain silent until she said it was safe. She rushed out of the room, leaving Midoriya clinging to his teddy, terrified and silent. From his hiding spot, Midoriya could hear shouting, but it wasn't his father's voice. 𝐒𝐽 seemed to be trying to calm the situation. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the house, and he heard 𝐼𝐻 scream. The atmosphere turned eerily quiet, and Midoriya remained hidden, eventually falling asleep. When he awoke, silence enveloped the house. Crawling out from under the bed, he ventured into the main room, only to find it empty and a strange substance on the floor. Crouching down, he sniffed it and realized it was BLD. Confused, he looked at the clock and suddenly remembered it was time for school. He assumed 𝐼𝐻 and 𝐒𝐽 were at work and decided to go to school by himself. He grabbed his bag and left the house, recalling the way to school. In class, they had a mini-test, and Midoriya confidently wrote down all the hiragana he knew. Ms. Naomi marked the test during lunch, and with a proud smile, she informed him that he had achieved a perfect score. Midoriya carefully placed the paper in his bag and joined the other kids. A boy named Bakugo asked Midoriya about his quirk. Midoriya thought carefully, remembering that 𝐼𝐻 had told him not to use his quirk because it could hurt his eye. He admitted that he couldn't use it, prompting Bakugo to question if he was quirkless. Midoriya, puzzled, accepted the label, and Bakugo teased him, calling him useless. After school, Midoriya rushed home to share his achievement with 𝐼𝐻 and 𝐒𝐽. However, upon opening the front door, he was met with an unsettling silence as he wandered aimlessly around the house. It was quiet, silent. He placed the test on the floor and stared at it. Maybe when 𝐼𝐻 and 𝐒𝐽 returned, they would see it. But they never came back. 8 years later, Midoriya opened the door to his house. The cold wind from outside 𝐒𝐮𝐽 out all the warmth within. He walked inside with a piece of paper in hand and placed it on the floor. Gazing around the house, he noticed that the majority of the floor was covered in test papers, all marked with 100% at the top. A voice cooed from the corner of the room, suggesting that they were gone because of him. Midoriya glanced at a misty shadow, shaped like a man, which grinned at him. He smiled a twisted smile in response and challenged the shadow to prove its claim. The shadow scoffed and vanished. Midoriya set his bag down by the dusty kitchen table and walked out of the deteriorating house. He strolled down a quiet street lined with a few food stores, each night using 𝐒𝐽's spare credit card to buy food. He had found it in the house office years ago, along with the pin written on a piece of paper. 𝐒𝐽 and 𝐼𝐻 had been successful businesspeople, but many companies envied them. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night, causing Midoriya to stop in his tracks. He looked down a dark alleyway and saw a man covering a girl's mouth, holding her hands behind her back. She struggled to escape. Midoriya noticed a broken pipe next to a dumpster in the alley. He quietly picked it up and climbed onto the dumpster. With a swift movement, he jumped down behind the man, pulling his head forward and using the sharp end of the pipe to incapacitate him. The man collapsed, releasing the girl, who fell over in shock. Midoriya tilted his head to the side, a devilish smile on his face, and walked back onto the street with his head down. He accidentally bumped into someone and looked up to see a tired-looking man with long black hair dressed in dark clothing, a white scarf wrapped around his neck. Midoriya tilted his head, recognizing 𝐼𝐻𝐬. He mumbled an apology and tried to walk past the hero, but 𝐼𝐻𝐬 grabbed his hand and asked if he had heard a girl scream down the alleyway. Midoriya replied that the girl was okay now and pulled his hand away, continuing on his way. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 walked down the alley, and Midoriya glared in his direction before sneaking after him, hiding behind the dumpster. The hero helped the girl up and walked her out onto the street. She pointed at a store, waved goodbye, and ran off. Midoriya sighed and dusted himself off, but suddenly found himself wrapped in 𝐼𝐻𝐬's scarf. He glanced up to see the hero holding the end of it. 𝐼𝐻𝐬 asked if he had killed the man. Midoriya stared back and tilted his head, admitting that he had assaulted him but that the man was still alive. The hero looked towards the spot where the attacker had been, but he was gone. Midoriya taunted 𝐒𝐻𝐬, indicating the man's location. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 spun around just in time to see the attacker charging at him, ready to strike. The man yelled, threatening the hero, but then suddenly froze, his body glowing a dim green. Midoriya seized the opportunity, escaping from the scarf and leaping over 𝐒𝐻𝐬's shoulders to tackle the man to the ground, pulling his arms behind his back. The glow faded away. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 approached and asked if Midoriya was a hero. Midoriya grinned, releasing his grip on the man and looking up at 𝐒𝐻𝐬, confirming his identity. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 noticed something concerning about Midoriya's eye, prompting Midoriya to cover it and whisper a plea not to take his eyes. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 pointed out that Midoriya was bleeding. Midoriya glanced at his hands, realizing the BLD was from using his quirk. A sharp pain suddenly pierced his stomach, and he glared down at the man who had stabbed him with the broken pipe. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 quickly tied the attacker's hands with his scarf and wrapped his arms around Midoriya's waist, jumping out of harm's way. He placed a hand over the stab wound, teasing Midoriya about needing to act quickly. Midoriya chuckled in response, acknowledging the truth in 𝐒𝐻𝐬's words. The restrained man yelled in frustration, demanding to know why they were having a casual conversation while he was trying to attack. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 instructed Midoriya to call the police and an ambulance. Midoriya admitted he didn't own a phone, but 𝐒𝐻𝐬 threw his own phone to him, telling him to use it. Midoriya's stomach growled, and he sighed as he called for help, putting the phone on speaker. The dispatcher answered, asking about the emergency. Midoriya informed them that 𝐒𝐻𝐬 had caught a villain on X Street. The dispatcher inquired if anyone was injured. Midoriya asked 𝐒𝐻𝐬 if he was hurt, to which 𝐒𝐻𝐬 grumbled about being older and preferred to be addressed as 𝐒𝐻𝐬. Midoriya sighed again, stating that no one was injured, despite 𝐒𝐻𝐬's protests. Midoriya tossed the phone back to 𝐒𝐻𝐬 and waved goodbye, stating he was hungry. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 caught the phone and set it down, unable to pursue Midoriya since his scarf was still tied around the villain. Midoriya walked into a small store and emerged moments later with a shopping bag. As the police arrived to arrest the man, 𝐒𝐻𝐬 pointed at Midoriya. The officers looked in his direction, and Midoriya, spotting their gaze, held up a peace sign before running away. Midoriya ran home, away from 𝐒𝐻𝐬. He sat down by the broken table and reached into the bag, pulling out a sandwich and eating it quietly. It was the same as most nights. He would buy food, go home, and eat it all alone in the silence. Sometimes his mind kept him company. The wound in his stomach stung, prompting him to tend to it. He unbuttoned his white shirt and took it off, reaching into the bag for alcohol wipes and bandages. He sat for a while, cleaning the large wound until it stopped bleeding, then did his best to close it up. The same shadow from earlier crawled along the ground towards Midoriya, taunting him about his actions. It accused him of being a murderer, but he defended himself, explaining that he had only paralyzed a man momentarily because his quirk would heal him anyway. The shadow continued to tease him, suggesting he let the wound get infected so he could finally die. Midoriya smirked, leaning toward the shadow and expressing his longing to live. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and the shadow vanished. Midoriya quickly hid behind the wall, pulling a pocket knife from his pocket as he heard quiet footsteps approaching. When the person got close, he tripped them and restrained their arms behind their back, holding the knife to their neck. Upon recognizing the familiar black hair, he smiled, remarking on the irony of a hero being defeated by a child. The hero, 𝐒𝐻𝐬, responded with a confident remark, and Midoriya felt something tighten around his ankle. He turned to see a scarf wrapping around his legs, glowing green before it began to unravel. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 inquired about Midoriya's quirk as he flipped him onto the floor and erased his abilities. He started tying the teen's arms. Midoriya struggled, revealing that his quirk was telekinesis. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 then asked where he lived, pulling Midoriya up and sitting him against the wall. Midoriya insisted he lived there, pouting at the suggestion that the place was abandoned. BLD dripped from his eye onto the ground, prompting 𝐒𝐻𝐬 to ask about his parents. Midoriya shrugged, suggesting they were probably dead. Just then, someone called out to 𝐒𝐻𝐬 from the front door. Izuku confirmed he had found Midoriya and instructed him to come along. When Midoriya questioned where they were going, Izuku stated he was taking him to the hospital. Midoriya protested, but Izuku tugged on the scarf, pulling him toward the front door and assuring him they could sort out his family issues later. Midoriya stared at the scarf around his wrist, realizing he couldn't use his quirk as Izuku smirked, erasing it. Izuku helped Midoriya into a police car and sat beside him as the officer drove off. While Izuku chatted with the policeman, Midoriya drifted into his thoughts, wondering about his parents and why he had to go to the hospital. The shadow reappeared beside him, ominously suggesting they would take his eyes. Midoriya covered his eyes, insisting they wouldn't. Izuku noticed Midoriya's distress and patted him on the shoulder, causing Midoriya to flinch and glare at him. When Izuku asked who he was talking to, Midoriya replied that he was just talking to himself. The car arrived at the emergency department, and Midoriya silently got out, followed by Izuku. They walked into the reception area, where Izuku and the policeman spoke with the receptionist. Midoriya longed to leave but was soon led into the emergency room by doctors. They treated his wound and examined his eye, deciding that surgery was necessary. He would have to wait 6 hours for the procedure since he had eaten, but it was already midnight. After the doctors left, Izuku came to visit Midoriya, who looked grumpy with a bandage covering his eye. Izuku asked what was wrong, and Midoriya complained about needing surgery. Izuku explained that they both needed their eyes to use their quirks, sharing his own experience with an eye injury. Midoriya dismissed Izuku's concerns, stating that his injury was from when he was 4 and that the eye was blind. When Izuku asked how it happened, Midoriya revealed that his father had slashed a knife at his eye, forcing a broken smile. Izuku acknowledged the difficulty of that experience, and Midoriya shrugged, insisting it was a long time ago. Izuku pointed out that it still must have been traumatic. Midoriya sighed and pulled the sheet over his head, feeling angered by the cleanliness of the hospital bed, as he was used to a much different environment. Izuku gently patted Midoriya's green hair, promising to visit him the next morning after the surgery. Midoriya wanted to ask why, but fatigue overcame him and he fell asleep. He was awakened by a nurse around 5:30 in the morning, who informed him that he would be going into surgery soon. After preparation, the surgery lasted an hour, and he woke up at 7:15, feeling groggy but eager not to miss school. He ripped the 4 out of his arm and quickly dressed, relieved that his long-sleeve school shirt absorbed the BLD from his arm. Sneaking out of the ward, he took the lift down to the ground floor and rushed out of the hospital, starting to run home. The shadow appeared beside him, mocking him for not escaping sooner. Midoriya turned down a side street, confronting the shadow, which floated beside him with an evil grin. He punched at the shadow in his mind, and it slowly faded away. Finally, Midoriya reached his house and walked into his bedroom, pulling out his clean uniform and putting it on. He wore a long-sleeve white shirt under a navy blue jumper and gray trousers. He gently tucked the shirt into his breaths and looked at himself in the cracked mirror. A bandage was tightly wrapped around his eye, and aside from that and the dark bags under his eyes, he looked like any other middle school student. He walked into the kitchen, swung his bag over his shoulder, and glanced at the time 8. He had 10 minutes to get to school, which was manageable. He left his deteriorating house and walked silently toward school. Unfortunately, he had been forced to tell the hospital his name, age, and school, so he would likely be found. This bothered him, but not as much as the aching pain in his head. The walk felt shorter than usual, and he soon arrived at school. He walked to his classroom and hung his bag on the hook of his desk. Other kids were already gathered in their groups, chatting away. A familiar voice called out to him, breaking the peaceful atmosphere. It was Katsuki, who immediately noticed the bandage on his eye and questioned what had happened. Midoriya brushed it off, trying to downplay the situation. Katsuki, frustrated, kicked him in the shin and snapped at him, suggesting he should jump off the roof. A shadowy figure approached Katsuki, taunting him to take his advice. Midoriya chuckled quietly, feeling a mix of annoyance and amusement. As the teacher entered the classroom and instructed everyone to quiet down, Midoriya found the day to be rather tedious. He wished he could go home and take a nap, as the pain in his eye was becoming increasingly bothersome. At the end of the day, Midoriya left the school quietly. As soon as he stepped out of the gate, someone grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a car. He recognized the figure by the distinctive white scarf. It was Izuku. Midoriya complained, asking him to leave him alone. The scarf began to wrap around him, securing him in place. Izuku sat him in the car and closed the door before taking the driver's seat. Midoriya felt too weak to escape from the scarf. Izuku expressed his frustration about Midoriya leaving the hospital, emphasizing that he had just undergone surgery. He reminded Midoriya that, without a guardian, the hospital was responsible for his health and safety and that he wasn't supposed to leave until they found him foster parents. Midoriya clicked his tongue and sighed, insisting he was fine on his own and did not want to go into foster care. Izuku pointed out that he was only 13, to which Midoriya argued that he had lived alone for 8 years and was capable of taking care of himself. Izuku was taken aback, questioning how a 5-year-old could survive without an adult or role model. Midoriya responded cynically, stating that many adults were either abusive or absent, and he would run away if placed in another home. He gazed out the window, observing the other students leaving school in their friend groups. He had never had a friend, as those who were bullied often became outcasts. Izuku then decided that Midoriya would stay with him. As they drove away from the school, Midoriya protested, insisting he wouldn't go and that Izuku couldn't make him. Izuku countered that it was either his house or being placed under the care of a stranger. Midoriya mumbled in defeat, pulling his legs up to his chest and looking out the window, contemplating running away. When they arrived at Midoriya's home, it appeared abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. Izuku suggested they go get Midoriya's belongings. As they entered the house, Midoriya paused, staring at the papers strewn across the floor, tests with perfect scores marked at the top. He explained to Izuku that he had received his first test back the day his guardians disappeared and had left it out, hoping they would see it when they returned from work. Midoriya carefully packed his few belongings into a box and picked it up, jokingly asking Izuku to teach him how to exist. Izuku followed him with a grin. The drive to Izuku's house felt long, and Midoriya's headache worsened, prompting him to try to sleep it off. Izuku gently shook him awake when they arrived, letting him know they were there. Midoriya nodded and carefully got out of the car, looking up at the impressive house in awe. It was massive and somewhat intimidating. Izuku picked up Midoriya's box and walked to the door, with Midoriya quietly following. Upon entering, they were greeted by a loud voice calling out Izuku's name. A man with blonde hair bounded down the stairs and embraced Izuku. Midoriya recognized him and made his presence known by closing the front door behind him. The blonde noticed Midoriya and approached him, asking who he was. Izuku introduced Midoriya as the problem child they were going to foster. The blonde exclaimed in surprise, his excitement evident. Izuku, tired from the day's events, asked him to keep his voice down. The blonde, now identified as Hisashi, picked Midoriya up in a cheerful embrace, celebrating the idea of having a new son. Midoriya, feeling overwhelmed, kicked Hisashi, causing him to drop him and trip over his own feet. Midoriya walked past the fallen hero and approached Izuku. Izuku laughed, teasing Hisashi about being bested by a kid. Midoriya glanced up at Izuku, reminding him that he had knocked him down too. Izuku sighed, conceding that he would take Midoriya to his room. Midoriya helped Hisashi back to his feet and followed Izuku up the stairs into a spacious bedroom. It contained a desk, a wardrobe, and a bed in the center of the room. Izuku asked where Midoriya would like to go to school. Izuku suggested that Midoriya could either stay at his current school or transfer to one closer to the house. Midoriya mumbled that he couldn't care less. Izuku then asked if he had friends at his current school. Midoriya shrugged and replied that one of the kids had told him to jump off a roof, which didn't seem like friendship to him. Izuku questioned whether that didn't bother him, but Midoriya simply shrugged and walked around the room. Izuku decided to put him in a different school and Midoriya stared at him, curious about why he cared. Izuku admitted that Midoriya interested him. Izuku threw his scarf towards Midoriya at incredible speed, but Midoriya caught it effortlessly and glared at the hero. Izuku smirked, noting that a professional wouldn't have been able to catch it, and wondered where Midoriya had learned his combat skills. Midoriya tilted his head, claiming that he must be better than a pro. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐬 informed him that he would enroll him in 𝐒𝐮𝐬 Junior High School, to which Midoriya expressed surprise, recognizing it as an elite school. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 pointed out that Midoriya had scored 100 on all his tests, so they would likely welcome him. He placed Midoriya's belongings on the bed and mentioned that dinner would be ready soon before leaving the room. The next day, 𝐒𝐮𝐬 took Midoriya to the entrance exam for 𝐒𝐮𝐬 Junior High School. The principal stated that Midoriya could attend if he scored above 80% on the exam. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 asked what Midoriya wanted to do after school, to which Midoriya jokingly replied that he might jump off a roof. He demonstrated by climbing onto a brick wall and leaping off, landing on his feet. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 scolded him for being reckless, but Midoriya shrugged it off as he entered the large private school. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 shook his head, a hint of a grin on his face. During the exam, Midoriya sat at a desk with a lengthy test. He had 3 hours to complete it, but finished in just half an hour. He asked the supervising teacher to grade it for the remaining time, and unsurprisingly he received a perfect score. Afterward, 𝐒𝐮𝐬 and Midoriya collected their uniforms and returned home, where they both took the afternoon to rest, as Midoriya was recovering from surgery and 𝐒𝐮𝐬 had only gotten a few hours of sleep. On Midoriya's first day at his new school, he was introduced to the class, but it quickly became apparent that not everyone was focused on their studies. Many students, regardless of gender, were similar to those from his previous school, with most gossiping or discussing crushes. Some students were curious about the eye patch Midoriya wore, which he had been reluctant to don, but 𝐒𝐮𝐬 insisted it was necessary to protect him from bright lights. A boy with blue hair and eyes approached Midoriya, introducing himself as 𝐒𝐮𝐬, the class president. He offered to show Midoriya around the school and help him gather his textbooks. Midoriya was skeptical but agreed to follow. As 𝐒𝐮 explained the various facilities, Midoriya didn't pay much attention, having already received a tour from the principal. They visited the library to pick up textbooks before returning to the classroom. 𝐒𝐮 mentioned that midterms were approaching and offered his notes if Midoriya needed them, but Midoriya politely declined. When the bell rang, they returned to class, and Midoriya took a nap during the final lesson, earning a scolding from the teacher, which he shrugged off. After school, Midoriya wandered into a forest, knowing the way to 𝐒𝐮𝐬's house but feeling too lazy to go there. He sat by a river, watching the water flow. A shadow in the trees taunted him, suggesting he jump in and let the current take him away. Midoriya glanced up, reminding the shadow that if he were to die, it would affect it too. The shadow dismissed his response, challenging Midoriya's courage. Midoriya sighed, stating he wouldn't die for the shadow but for himself. The shadow then suggested it was time for his patrol, and Midoriya agreed, standing up and brushing himself off. He walked out of the forest and toward the city, making a habit of going on patrols like a hero, but without the heroic demeanor. He focused on eliminating villains with malicious intentions or heroes obsessed with fame. Midoriya entered a small underground store, where the owners stared at him. He waved with a mischievous smile and walked through the staff doors. Someone called out to him, and he recognized Stain, who slid a cup of tea across the table. Midoriya set his bag down and mentioned he had been busy, explaining that a hero was fostering him, which limited his time out. Stain inquired about which hero was involved. 𝐒𝐻𝐴 had attacked them recently, and Midoriya wore a devilish smirk as he recalled the event. Stain questioned whether 𝐒𝐻𝐴 knew Midoriya's true identity. Midoriya approached a locker and slipped on a long-sleeve white shirt, methodically buttoning it up. He mumbled that he doubted 𝐒𝐻𝐴 knew. Stain's gaze fell on the stitches on Midoriya's stomach, prompting him to ask if Midoriya had been stabbed. Midoriya explained that he had been about to confront a man who had attacked a girl but had hesitated because he wasn't in disguise. He then donned a black vest and tied a tie around his neck. Stain acknowledged this with a mumbled agreement and mentioned he should be on his way. Midoriya pulled a white wig over his head and secured a black eye mask with white eye holes in place. Stain advised him to stay safe as the sun was setting and mentioned he would likely go out later. Midoriya tucked a dagger into his belt and exited the staff room. The shopkeeper waved as he passed by. He slipped into an alleyway and climbed a set of stairs to the roof, where he surveyed the civilians below. Everything seemed normal, so he settled at the edge of the building, his legs dangling off. A shadow appeared beside him, suggesting he should jump. Midoriya stood up and dove off the building. His body glowed a light green as he levitated, looking up at the shadow with a satisfied grin, which caused the shadow to appear horrified. Midoriya teased that it seemed someone didn't want to disappear forever, prompting the shadow to scoff and vanish. Hearing a distant scream, Midoriya turned toward the source of the distress. A villain was in the street, causing chaos as civilians fled, but one woman had been caught. Midoriya flew down, landing on the villain's shoulders. The villain threatened to harm the woman if Midoriya didn't get off. Midoriya jumped down and confronted the villain directly. As the villain froze, Midoriya carefully freed the woman, urging her to run to the police. She nodded and fled in panic. Midoriya then let the villain go, who angrily called him a stupid hero. Midoriya chuckled, asserting that he wasn't a hero, as heroes wouldn't kill. With a flick of his hand, the villain's head detached from his body, and Midoriya leapt into the air, quickly ascending to the rooftop. He mumbled that sparring with heroes was much more exciting. He jumped across rooftops until he found another villain tormenting civilians, with no heroes in sight. Midoriya leaped off the building and glided down next to the villain. Holding up his hand with a smirk, he caught the villain off guard as the villain quickly dashed behind him. Midoriya turned just in time to see the villain's foot coming toward him, which he caught before it could connect. The force created a shockwave of wind. Midoriya smiled, intrigued by the villain's speed. He dashed among the civilians at a speed that was nearly imperceptible, then jumped to kick the villain. The villain managed to catch Midoriya's foot just before it made contact. Impressed, he remarked on Midoriya's skill. Midoriya smirked, noting that people usually assumed he was a hero. The villain laughed, pointing out that heroes didn't attack other heroes, and added a comment about Midoriya's height. Midoriya caught the villain's arm and bent it behind his back, pouting at the comment about his height. Suddenly, sharp appendages shot from the villain's arm, piercing Midoriya's own arm and hand. Midoriya's eyes widened, but he maintained his smirk, finding the situation amusing. The villain boasted about being a B-ranked villain and questioned Midoriya's chances against him. In response, Midoriya kicked the villain, causing him to fall to the ground in pain. Midoriya smiled, declaring that the villain had lost the moment he saw him. He knocked the villain out with a kick to the head. A man nearby shouted for him not to move neutral, which made Midoriya snicker at the label. He waved before flying up to a building, examining his bleeding hand and arm with a grin, noting the damage done. Sensing something familiar approaching, he quickly caught it behind his back. Turning, he found Aizawa standing there, surprised that Midoriya had caught it. Aizawa expressed his frustration, explaining that he needed Midoriya's help with a fight on the other side of the city. Midoriya stood up, considering the risk, and asked what kind of fight it was. Aizawa informed him that an A-ranked villain was holding hostages. After a moment of thought, Midoriya nodded slightly, agreeing to help but insisting they make it quick. The two of them ran across the rooftops in silence, their footsteps echoing with each jump. Soon, they heard piercing sirens from the streets below and looked down to see a building engulfed in flames, surrounded by police cars and firefighters battling the blaze. Midoriya jumped off the tall building, landing on the footpath, while Aizawa swung down using his scarf. Aizawa asked if the landing hurt, to which Midoriya shook his head. They approached the burning building and slipped under the caution tape. Midoriya expressed surprise that Aizawa had asked for his help, to which Aizawa replied that there were no other heroes around and that Midoriya was not quite a villain. Midoriya attempted to open the door but found it locked. Aizawa teased him about it, prompting Midoriya to kick the door down. They quietly entered the building, which was dark and hot inside. Aizawa noted the heat, and they continued their search. Midoriya looked around, noting the fires burning upstairs. Aizawa ascended the stairs, with Midoriya following quietly. Aizawa remarked that all the commotion was on the third floor and instructed not to harm civilians, promising they would let them go today. Midoriya, patting Aizawa on the shoulder, reminded him that he had never harmed the innocent. Aizawa scoffed, questioning what he hadn't done that other heroes had. Midoriya listed that Aizawa hadn't abused his rights, harmed anyone without cause, or taken lives unnecessarily. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 acknowledged he had taken lives but insisted it was for a reason, adding that he wasn't a hero. As they reached the final set of stairs, they stood before a set of doors. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 warned Midoriya not to kill the villain inside, prompting a sigh from Midoriya, who questioned whether they were entering without a plan. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 replied that they had no time for a good plan and kicked the doors down. Midoriya quickly hid behind the wall. Inside the room, about 20 office workers were tied together, and a familiar villain sat on one of the desks, wearing an ecstatic smile. 𝗟𝗶𝐻, the villain, noticed them and commented on Midoriya's appearance, questioning if he was a hero. Midoriya glared at him, muttering about wanting to take him down. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 snapped at Midoriya not to kill him. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 raised his hand, unleashing fire that surged toward them, but Midoriya created a wind shield that redirected the flames to the walls. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬, surprised, asked about Midoriya's quirk. Midoriya, focused on the battle, ran to the other side of the room. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 smirked, attempting to use his quirk, but 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 had already erased it. Midoriya smirked back, declaring 𝗟𝗶𝐻 had lost. However, 𝗟𝗶𝐻 revealed a trick as his body melted into a viscous liquid. Midoriya gasped, realizing it was a clone. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 snapped at Midoriya to look behind him just as 𝗟𝗶𝐻 and twice crashed through the window. Midoriya reacted quickly, grabbing 𝗟𝗶𝐻's arm and throwing him across the room. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 landed gracefully, expressing frustration at 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 for not mentioning the presence of two powerful villains. Midoriya, feeling overwhelmed, held his head in his hands. Suddenly, everyone in the room began to glow green, including the hostages, who were frozen in place. Midoriya carefully floated the hostages down to the police and released them from his quirk. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 teased Midoriya about his strong quirk, which only fueled Midoriya's anger. Twice launched a punch at Midoriya, who caught it and flung twice toward 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 grinned, claiming he would handle Midoriya, and unleashed fire in his direction. Midoriya leaped out the window, using his quirk to levitate in the air. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 followed him, using fire to propel himself, sending fireballs after Midoriya. As Midoriya dodged, he noticed debris from the building beginning to float. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 continued to fire bolts of flame, but Midoriya remained agile, eventually pausing in midair. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 smirked, questioning if Midoriya had a death wish. Fire struck Midoriya's back, singeing his clothes. With a determined smirk, Midoriya swiped his finger through the air, sending a shard of glass toward 𝗟𝗶𝐻. 𝗟𝗶𝐻 spun around, trying to fend off the incoming debris. Midoriya took advantage of the distraction, sending a car crashing into 𝗟𝗶𝐻, propelling him into the roof of a nearby building. Midoriya glided down to the villain, who struggled to stand, clearly in pain. 𝗟𝗶𝐻, hissing in frustration, questioned how Midoriya's quirk was so powerful. Midoriya stood over him, explaining that he manipulated particles and could control solids, liquids, and gases without relying solely on his eyes. He encouraged 𝗟𝗶𝐻 not to limit his quirk, poking him in the face and warning him to leave before facing dire consequences. As a portal opened beside them, a hand reached out and pulled 𝗟𝗶𝐻 away. Midoriya waved goodbye as the villain disappeared through the portal. He descended into the building, finding 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 speaking with the police. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 asked about 𝗟𝗶𝐻's fate, to which Midoriya shrugged, stating he was gone. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 noted that at least the civilians were safe. Midoriya surveyed the remaining rubble and glass, causing it all to float with a flick of his hand. He concentrated, crunching the debris into smaller pieces and forming it into a large ball, asking where it should go. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 directed him to a dumpster down an alleyway. Midoriya opened the lid with his quirk and moved all the debris inside. With the cleanup complete, he turned to 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬, asking if he could leave. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 nodded, mentioning a burn on Midoriya's back. Midoriya acknowledged it, saying goodbye before launching himself into the air and flying away from the scene. He glided towards the base and walked down the stairs. The owner merely waved as Midoriya passed by. He entered the staff room and began changing back into his school uniform. After swinging his bag over his shoulder, he stepped back out onto the streets. As he glanced down an alleyway, he spotted 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 engaged in a fierce confrontation with 𝗟𝗓𝐻. A mischievous grin spread across his face as he approached the scene. 𝐒𝐮𝐲𝐬 noticed Midoriya and urgently warned him to stay away, emphasizing the danger 𝗟𝗓𝗍 posed. However, Midoriya, feeling restless, expressed his longing to help with a playful smile. In a swift motion, 𝐮𝐴𝐴 struck 𝐒𝐻𝐬, causing him to stumble. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 struggled to regain his footing, attempting to erase the villain's quirk but found himself unable to act. Midoriya seized the moment and threw his pocket knife at 𝐮𝐴𝐴, the blade soaring through the air and embedding itself in the villain's side. 𝐮𝐴𝐴 dashed past Midoriya, narrowly slicing at his arm as he whispered a chilling invitation. 𝐒𝐻𝐬, desperate to intervene, fought to regain his strength. Midoriya quickly maneuvered behind 𝐮𝐴𝐴 and delivered a kick to the villain's head, teasingly asking if he could have some fun first. 𝐮𝐴𝐴 chuckled darkly and retaliated, throwing Midoriya against the wall. Undeterred, Midoriya flipped off the wall and landed in front of 𝐮𝐴𝐴, who taunted him for being too slow. The villain liked the blade of his katana, and Midoriya fell to the ground, a fierce determination in his eyes. With 𝐮𝐴𝐴 holding the katana dangerously close to him, 𝐒𝐻𝐬 sprang into action, gripping his scarf tightly. 𝐮𝐴𝐴 warned 𝐒𝐻𝐬 not to approach, but 𝐒𝐻𝐬 glared back defiantly and erased 𝐮𝐴𝐴's quirk. 𝐮𝐴𝐴 smirked, confident that he had already incapacitated Midoriya. In a swift motion, 𝐮𝐴𝐴 kicked Midoriya, rendering him unconscious. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 shouted in alarm as 𝐮𝐴𝐴 fled the scene. Rushing to Midoriya's side, 𝐒𝐻𝐬 carefully lifted him, muttering under his breath in concern. Later, 𝐒𝐻𝐬 sat by Midoriya's bedside, watching over him as he slept. After the confrontation with 𝐮𝐴𝐴, 𝐒𝐻𝐬 had taken a day off from work to care for both himself and Midoriya. Hisashi entered the room with 2 glasses of water, handing one to 𝐒𝐻𝐬. He inquired about Midoriya's condition, to which 𝐒𝐻𝐬 replied that Midoriya had not yet awakened. Hisashi, trying to lighten the mood, playfully poured water over Midoriya's head, startling him awake. Midoriya shot a glare at Hisashi, who quickly retreated, blaming 𝐒𝐻𝐬 for the prank. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 offered Midoriya a glass of water, asking how he felt. Midoriya accepted the drink and inquired about the time. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 informed him that it was close to midnight and asked if he wanted something to eat. Midoriya declined, opting instead to take a shower. As Midoriya entered the bathroom, he locked the door and turned on the shower. He removed his school shirt, revealing the patched-up injuries from his encounter with 𝐮𝐴𝐴. He noticed the familiar bandage on his wrist, relieved that 𝐒𝐻𝐬 had not discovered his secret. Carefully, he unraveled the bandage, revealing healing scars that were consistently spaced and sized. A shadow loomed before him, taunting him about his past. Midoriya glared defiantly at the shadow, pulling a blade from his pocket and contemplating his scars. He made a small incision beneath an old scar, watching as droplets of BLD formed. He had always inflicted a cut on himself after each villain he faced, a reminder of the battles he fought. After removing the bandages, he stepped into the shower, letting the warm water wash over him, a rare comfort he had missed. Once finished, he dried off carefully, avoiding his injuries, and dressed in fresh pajamas before leaving the bathroom. Hisashi, still in the kitchen, offered him food, but Midoriya declined, feeling tired. He retreated to his room, sinking into the comfortable bed and quickly drifting off to sleep. The next morning, Midoriya awoke early to silence in the house. Wondering if everyone had left him again, he ventured downstairs into the dim kitchen. Exploring the house, he discovered a gym, a theater, and a music room. In the music room, he admired the instruments, guessing they belonged to Hisashi. Though he had never played, he had learned about music in his youth and often mimicked the finger movements in the air. Not wanting to disturb anything, he left the music room and found Hisashi making coffee in the kitchen. Sneaking up behind him, Midoriya greeted him softly, causing Hisashi to jump in surprise and question how he had approached so quietly. Midoriya simply smiled, enjoying the moment. Hisashi mumbled about feeling the presence of a little listener, while Midoriya playfully stuck his tongue out, admitting that sometimes he didn't have one. Hisashi pouted, questioning how 𝐒𝐮𝐽 had found Midoriya. When asked if he was hungry, Midoriya shrugged, saying he wasn't really. A white scarf wrapped around Midoriya, and he glanced at 𝐒𝐻𝐬, who looked rather worn out. 𝐒𝐻𝐬 glared at Midoriya, reminding him that he hadn't eaten dinner and could have breakfast instead. Midoriya pouted and insisted on being let go, but 𝐒𝐻𝐬 simply poked his tongue out in response. In a moment of defiance, Midoriya used his quirk to freeze Izuku's body, then escaped the scarf and quickly wrapped it around Izuku before releasing him from his quirk. Hisashi noted how similar Midoriya's quirk was to someone named Neutral. Curious, Midoriya asked about Neutral, and Hisashi explained that he was a hero villain, not quite a vigilante. He pulled out his phone to show a video of Neutral attacking 𝗟𝗶𝗸, prompting Midoriya to acknowledge the similarity, even though he downplayed his own abilities. Hisashi suggested they might be related somehow, and Izuku chimed in about their shared height, which made Midoriya growl in frustration. When Izuku asked what Midoriya planned to do after middle school, he scoffed, saying he wasn't allowed to be a hero. When Hisashi pressed for a reason, Midoriya revealed that his father had told him it was his fault his mother had died. Izuku dismissed this notion, arguing that it wasn't Midoriya's fault since his parents had made the decision to conceive him. Midoriya felt conflicted, haunted by his father's words. A shadow whispered to him, suggesting he should take drastic action against the heroes. Midoriya glared at the shadow, feeling a surge of anger. Izuku and Hisashi exchanged glances, confused by Midoriya's reaction. When asked what he was glaring at, Midoriya flinched and insisted it was nothing. Izuku then suggested they eat breakfast, and Hisashi offered to make pancakes, which made Midoriya blush at the thought, recalling the delicious pancakes Naoki had made for him. The three boys spent the weekend playing video games, where Midoriya struggled but enjoyed their company. He wanted to confront Stain but decided to wait until after his midterms, which were approaching. Midoriya found the midterms surprisingly easy. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 kept asking if he needed help studying, which annoyed Midoriya, but he eventually agreed to study together before the last exam, Math. On Thursday, as Midoriya packed his things, 𝐻𝐻𝐸 stood by his desk, asking if he was ready. Midoriya replied that he needed a moment and pulled out his phone. A teacher called for 𝐻𝐻𝐸 to take something to the staff room, and he rushed off, telling Midoriya to wait. Curious about his phone, Midoriya opened messages and saw a group contact. Izuku had insisted he contact him when he got home, which Midoriya had resisted, but he felt a sense of normalcy using the device. He sent a message to Izuku and Hisashi, letting them know he was studying at the library and would walk back later. Hisashi playfully asked if he had a girlfriend, which Midoriya dismissed with a humorous retort. Suddenly, a classmate approached Midoriya, smirking and asking if he was quirkless, as someone from his previous school had claimed. The other students turned to look at Midoriya, who smiled, knowing Katsuki had spread that rumor. He shrugged, asking if it mattered. Just then, a girl with black hair intervened, telling the boys to leave Midoriya alone. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 returned and inquired about the situation, but Midoriya quickly took his arm, insisting they go study instead. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 protested that immature behavior should be corrected, but Midoriya smiled, saying some people wouldn't change. Once in the library, 𝐻𝐻𝐸 asked what had happened. Midoriya explained that some kids had called him quirkless, and 𝐻𝐻𝐸 expressed confusion over why that was important. They settled down to study, and Midoriya took out his math book, quickly working through the equations. After finishing, 𝐻𝐻𝐸 asked about the extension work, and Midoriya proudly shared that he had completed it as well. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 was impressed by how quickly Midoriya had worked through everything and asked to see his answers. Midoriya pushed his book over, and 𝐻𝐻𝐸 flipped through the pages, amazed at the neatness and correctness of the equations. They continued studying together, and after a few hours, both boys made their way back home. 𝐻𝐻𝐸 flipped through the pages, staring at all the neat equations in the book. They were all correctly answered. He wondered how Midoriya managed to solve them so quickly. Midoriya mumbled that it was easy, and 𝐻𝐻𝐸 smiled at him, curious about his confidence. Midoriya continued to breeze through the questions 𝐻𝐻𝐸 provided, and after a few hours of study, both boys made their way back home. It was Friday afternoon when Midoriya left school and walked into the city. He decided it was time to confront Stain and perhaps go on a few patrols. He sneaked into a small shop and passed the owner into the staff room, where he found Stain cooking something in the little kitchen. Midoriya announced his intention to confront Stain, who chuckled and threw a knife that narrowly missed Midoriya, grazing his cheek. Stain smiled, amused by the challenge. Midoriya caught the knife and spun it on his finger, confirming his intent. Stain remarked on the absurdity of a child challenging an S-ranked villain, boasting about his own reputation. Midoriya, undeterred, threw the knife at 𝐒𝐮𝐲 with incredible speed. 𝐒𝐮𝐲's eyes widened as he jumped aside, but the knife lodged itself into his shoulder. Midoriya pointed out that the heroes simply didn't recognize 𝐒𝐮𝐲 as a villain, and he used his quirk to freeze 𝐒𝐮𝐲's body before approaching him. Midoriya removed the knife from 𝐒𝐮𝐲's shoulder, watching as a trail of BLD followed the blade. He mused about the effects of 𝐒𝐮𝐲's BLD on himself, teasingly holding the knife near 𝐒𝐮𝐲's lips and allowing the BLD to drip. He then forced 𝐒𝐮𝐲 to drink water mixed with his own BLD, knowing that the villain's BLD type would prolong his paralysis. When Midoriya released his quirk, 𝐒𝐮𝐲 fell to the ground, still smirking despite his predicament. Midoriya reminded him that he was simply returning the favor from their last encounter. As Midoriya changed into his uniform, 𝐒𝐮𝐲 complained about his interrupted cooking. Midoriya assured him that he would soon be able to eat, playfully slipping on his mask before leaving the room. The city was relatively quiet. Midoriya perched on a rooftop, feeling the rough wind tug at his disguise. He observed the bustling streets below, filled with families and friends enjoying their evening. There were no villains in sight, and while he could spot the heroes in their distinctive costumes, he had already deemed them worthy in his hero analysis book. If he couldn't become a hero himself, he resolved to ensure that all heroes were good enough, focusing on their character and decency. As the sky transformed into hues of orange and yellow, Midoriya leapt across rooftops toward a more dangerous part of the city. He spotted a hero engaged in battle with a villain but pressed on into the more perilous areas. He stood atop a building, listening for cries of distress, but heard none. Suddenly he sensed someone behind him and turned to find a villain with a wide smirk, who taunted him about the injuries he had inflicted on the villain's associates. Midoriya calmly stated that those who commit inhumane acts should expect consequences. The villain threatened to remove Midoriya's mask and beat him until he was unrecognizable, brandishing a knife. Midoriya felt a surge of irritation at the villain's bravado and warned him to leave unless he wanted to face dire consequences. The villain shot a bullet from his finger, but Midoriya dodged it. However, the bullet spun around and struck him in the back, causing him to wince in pain. The villain laughed, explaining that his bullets were designed to inject poison. Midoriya coughed, asking how long the effects would last. The villain refused to divulge that information and attempted to kick Midoriya, but he quickly froze the villain in place. Defiant, Midoriya lifted his finger, sending the villain flying into the air before crashing back down. As the villain cried out in pain, Midoriya approached him and demanded to know how long the poison would last. The villain, now desperate, revealed it would only last an hour and would cause dizziness and nausea. Midoriya, unimpressed, stomped on the villain's head, knocking him out. Feeling dizzy himself, Midoriya sat at the edge of the rooftop. The world spun around him, and he struggled to focus as someone approached. He squinted and recognized 𝐼𝐼𝐽 crouching in front of him. Midoriya felt a rush of panic at being discovered in such a state. 𝐼𝐽 shook him, demanding to know where he had been shot. Midoriya mumbled about his back, and 𝐼𝐽 inspected the wound, removing the bullet with a swift motion. Midoriya glared at him, commenting on the roughness of the action. 𝐼𝐽 examined the peculiar bullet, noting the sharp needle at its end. He explained that this villain had been causing trouble for a while, and he had come to find him, only to discover that Midoriya had beaten him to it once again. Midoriya smiled mischievously, feeling a sense of pride in his actions. 𝐼𝐽 asked if Midoriya was using his quirk to slow the effects of the poison. Midoriya admitted that he had frozen the poison with his mind, but he was struggling because of a severe headache. 𝐼𝐽 chuckled, suggesting it would be amusing if he erased Midoriya's quirk. Midoriya retorted that 𝐼𝐽 might not enjoy the consequences of that. He bit onto the finger of his glove and pulled it off, which left 𝐼𝐽 looking confused. Midoriya then drew a dagger from his belt and made a small cut on his hand. 𝐼𝐽 snapped in alarm, searching for a bandage as Midoriya closed his eyes and concentrated. A purple liquid floated out of the cut in his hand, and he smiled, claiming the problem was solved. 𝐼𝐽, however, pointed out that Midoriya still had a cut on his hand. In response, Midoriya cut a piece from 𝐼𝐽's scarf and wrapped it around his hand, smirking as he declared the issue resolved. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 protested that the scarf was expensive, but Midoriya shrugged it off. Curious about why 𝐒𝐮𝐲 hadn't turned him in, Midoriya learned that 𝐒𝐮𝐲 found him more useful than other heroes and found him interesting. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 then suggested they carry the villain down to the police, noting that the villain looked heavy. With a flick of his wrist, Midoriya made the villain's unconscious body float down towards a police car. 𝐒𝐮𝐲, feeling relaxed, invited Midoriya for a drink, but Midoriya hesitated, explaining that he was under the legal drinking age. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 was surprised to learn that Midoriya was under 20, and they exchanged playful banter about the legal drinking age versus Midoriya's actions as a hero. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 suggested they take the alleyway to avoid the police, and he playfully pushed Midoriya off the building. Midoriya gasped but managed to grab onto a windowsill. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 swung down using his scarf, and Midoriya dropped down in front of him, annoyed by the push. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 found Midoriya entertaining as they made their way to an underground bar. Once seated, 𝐒𝐮𝐲 asked about Midoriya's age, but Midoriya refused to disclose it. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 then inquired if Midoriya attended school, and when Midoriya confirmed he did, 𝐒𝐮𝐲 offered him a chance to teach a class at UA. Midoriya was skeptical, wondering why people wouldn't want him arrested, but 𝐒𝐮𝐲 assured him that he was well liked for capturing villains. After some back and forth, Midoriya agreed to the offer, and 𝐒𝐮𝐲 instructed him to come to UA on Monday at 8 a.m. They spent the afternoon chatting, with Midoriya sticking to water while 𝐒𝐮𝐲 enjoyed a drink. On Monday morning, 𝐒𝐮𝐲 called up the stairs, reminding Midoriya that he would be late for school. Midoriya, dressed casually, mumbled that he was skipping. When 𝐒𝐮𝐲 asked why, Midoriya explained that he always avoided school on midterm results day, as he received too much attention from teachers and bullying from classmates. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 reassured him that things would be different at his new school, but Midoriya was skeptical, recalling a recent near attack from a student. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 then invited Midoriya to come to work with him, mentioning that a teacher named 𝗏𝐿 would be leading a class that day. Midoriya, realizing 𝐒𝐮𝐲 didn't recognize him as 𝗏𝐿, declined the offer, saying he would study in the library instead. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 agreed to call the school and report Midoriya as sick before heading to work. Once 𝐒𝐮𝐲 left, Midoriya quickly changed into his usual attire and prepared to fly to his underground base. There he encountered 𝗟𝗓, who wished him well for his plans at UA. Midoriya flew to UA, landing in front of 𝐒𝐮𝐲, who was startled by his sudden appearance. After a brief exchange, they entered the school together. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 explained that Midoriya would be acting as a villain for a first-year class, who would have 30 minutes to capture him. Midoriya scoffed at the challenge, recalling a previous battle where 𝐒𝐮𝐲 had struggled to catch him. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 insisted that Midoriya should go easy on the students, as they were inexperienced. Midoriya tilted his head to the side, pondering the situation. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 smiled and confirmed his thoughts. Midoriya expressed his disappointment, asking for a list of the students' quirks and names. 𝐒𝐮𝐲, having anticipated this, tossed a clipboard at Midoriya, who caught it with a grateful smile. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 then instructed him to read it on the bus as they made their way to the classroom. Upon entering the classroom labeled 1A, 𝐒𝐮𝐲 commanded everyone to stand up, announcing their trip to a simulated city to confront 𝗏𝐿. Midoriya entered with a smile, causing the students to gasp and murmur among themselves. Following 𝐒𝐮𝐲's orders, the class stood and exited, with Midoriya and 𝐒𝐮𝐲 being the last to leave. As they walked to the bus, many students glanced back at Midoriya, who maintained his cheerful demeanor. During the bus ride, Midoriya immersed himself in the information about the students' quirks while the others continued to discuss him. A student with long red hair approached Midoriya, expressing his disdain and questioning why someone like him was allowed there. Midoriya remained calm, smiling as 𝐒𝐮𝐲 glared at him, his hair floating in agitation. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 intervened, warning the student to sit down before things escalated. Midoriya chuckled, teasing the student about his intentions. 𝐒𝐮𝐲 swiftly used his binding cloth to restrain the student and pushed him into a seat, releasing him afterward. Midoriya smirked, suggesting he would have only caused minor harm if his quirk had been active. The student, frustrated, attempted to strike Midoriya but was swiftly subdued as Midoriya flipped him onto the ground, holding his arm behind his back. Midoriya noted that without his quirk, the student would have faced significant consequences. He then reset the boy's shoulder with a gentle motion, offering advice on managing his anger and suggesting that food might help. Aizawa sighed, acknowledging the situation, while Midoriya smiled, pleased with his own actions. As the bus arrived at the simulated city, everyone entered the observation room. Aizawa explained the rules. Pairs would need to capture neutral within 30 minutes, and if neutral immobilized them, they would lose. A screen displayed the pairings, with one group of 3 due to Aizawa's decision regarding Tomoko. Aizawa encouraged Midoriya to take it easy on the students, reminding him of their limited training. Midoriya, with a cheeky grin, saluted and left the observation room. The first battle proved to be a test of patience for Midoriya as he floated above, observing the students' attempts to strategize against him. When the next pair entered, Midoriya recognized Mirio Togata and Tamaki Amajiki. Mirio attempted to surprise Midoriya from behind, but Midoriya evaded him, suggesting that he should punch to enhance his speed. Mirio hesitated, not wanting to hurt Midoriya, who reminded him that real fights often resulted in injuries. Tamaki's quirk manifested as a tentacle that wrapped around Midoriya, who admired its uniqueness before freezing it and freeing himself. He caught Mirio's punch midair, demonstrating his skill as he threw Mirio to the ground, advising him on how to better utilize his quirk. The 2 students spent their time improving their techniques, and while they managed to bind Midoriya momentarily, they ultimately could not capture him. Midoriya acknowledged their potential as they returned to their class, having learned valuable lessons. The final pair of students approached, both eager to prove themselves. One of them possessed the ability to take control of others, and as she attempted to use her quirk on Midoriya, he felt a momentary lapse in consciousness. A sudden jolt brought him back to reality, and he quickly maneuvered behind her, tying her eyes with his tie and securing her hands with 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽𝐻𝐻. Midoriya offered a piece of advice about not worrying about opponents' injuries before swiftly handling the other student as well. With both students restrained, he declared his victory and released them from their cuffs. As they all headed back to the control center, Aizawa glanced at Midoriya, inquiring about his arm. Midoriya, with a smile, admitted it was broken, leaving Aizawa momentarily stunned. Midoriya straightened his tie, contemplating how to handle his injury. He realized that Recovery Girl was on leave, which left him in a bit of a bind. Aizawa, noticing his discomfort, pushed Midoriya into a chair and began wrapping his arm with his binding scarf. Midoriya mumbled about the cost of the scarf, to which Aizawa replied that he could return it once Midoriya's arm was in a cast. Midoriya pouted at the thought of a cast. One of the students approached them, offering a proper bandage he had pulled from his pocket. Aizawa gladly accepted it, while Midoriya insisted he was fine and could keep the bandage. The student, however, insisted on helping, noting that they should respect their elders. Midoriya pointed out that he was actually younger than them, which left everyone momentarily stunned, especially Aizawa, who had assumed Midoriya was at least 17 when he mentioned being a minor. Midoriya clarified that he was barely a teenager. Despite the encouragement from his classmates that he could still become a hero, Midoriya shook his head, stating that he wasn't allowed to be one. He stood up and unraveled Aizawa's scarf, dropping it to the floor. He then expressed that he would always be around, doing what he did best. With a flourish, he pulled a stack of cards from his blazer pocket, bending them so they flew into the air. As they fell, they obscured his body, and by the time they landed, he had vanished. Aizawa snapped in frustration, unable to chase after Midoriya as he had to keep an eye on the class. He waited impatiently for the day to end. Midoriya returned to his base and quickly changed into his casual clothes. Stain emerged from another room, noting that Midoriya was back early. Midoriya explained that he had broken his arm, holding it up for Stain to see. Stain urged him to sit down so he could examine the injury. As Stain assessed Midoriya's arm, he expressed concern about the pain and wondered why Midoriya wasn't crying. Midoriya explained that showing pain only made things worse in the past. Stain reassured him that no one would hurt him now and began to massage his arm to help ease the discomfort. Midoriya bit his lip to suppress the pain. Midoriya then asked how he could hide a broken bone. Stain suggested that he should open up to Aizawa, but Midoriya firmly stated that he didn't trust people. 𝐒𝐮 pointed out that 𝐒𝐬𝐬 was a good hero and that Midoriya couldn't hide from him forever. He warned that one day, Midoriya might find himself in trouble, and 𝐒𝐬𝐬 wouldn't be able to help if he didn't trust him. Midoriya rested his head on 𝐒𝐮's shoulder and remarked that he trusted 𝐒𝐮 because he had saved him in the past. 𝐒𝐮 acknowledged that he hadn't done much but felt a responsibility toward Midoriya. He carefully wrapped Midoriya's arm, and Midoriya expressed gratitude, noting that it hurt less now. 𝐒𝐮 reminded him to ice it when he got home and wished him a safe journey. Midoriya nodded and left the room, walking quietly onto the streets. He preferred the solitude of a dark alleyway where he wouldn't be seen. However, someone emerged from the shadows, blocking his path. Recognizing the figure as a villain, Midoriya braced himself. The villain accused him of being neutral, claiming they shared the same quirk. Midoriya dismissed the accusation and attempted to walk past, but the villain insisted he wouldn't be ignored. Suddenly, Midoriya felt a drain of power from his body as the villain used his quirk against him, throwing him against the wall. Midoriya winced, holding his arm in pain. The villain taunted him, questioning how he could use his quirk while injured. Midoriya, feeling overwhelmed, tried to defend himself but was met with more force. Each impact against the wall intensified his discomfort, and he struggled to maintain his composure. A shadowy figure appeared beside the villain, smirking and threatening Midoriya if he made a sound. Midoriya, feeling trapped, closed his eyes and braced for another blow. He was thrown against the wall again, and this time he couldn't shield himself as the pain surged through him. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, 𝐒𝐬𝐬 burst onto the scene, kicking the villain to the ground and intervening in the confrontation. After noticing 𝐒𝐬𝐬, the teen slid down the wall, feeling somewhat relaxed now that 𝐒𝐬𝐬 had arrived. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 bound the villain and then glanced at Midoriya, quickly asking if he was okay and what had happened. Midoriya mumbled that the villain had attacked him with his own quirk. The villain snapped back, revealing that Midoriya's quirk was the same as his own and that he had fought him before. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 stared at the villain, then turned his attention back to Midoriya, who felt the power of his quirk returning. Midoriya explained that he had been on his way home from the cafe where he had been studying when the villain attacked him. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 sighed and called the police and an ambulance. The police arrested the villain, who attempted to resist but was subdued by 𝐒𝐬𝐬's quirk. After the police car drove off, 𝐒𝐬𝐬 picked Midoriya up. He noticed the pain in Midoriya's arm and quietly asked why he wouldn't cry. Midoriya covered his only functioning eye with his hand, the one that hadn't been injured, and whispered that he couldn't. When the ambulance arrived, 𝐒𝐬𝐬 climbed into the back and laid Midoriya on the stretcher. The paramedics began to treat his injuries as they drove toward the hospital, but Midoriya refused to let them near his face. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 watched quietly, pondering what the villain had said about Midoriya being neutral. At the hospital, Midoriya received pain medication, and the doctors did their best to treat his arm without surgery, utilizing one of the doctor's bone-repairing quirks. Eventually, Midoriya was sent home with his arm tightly wrapped in a sling and feeling numb from the medication. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 helped the injured teen to his room and laid him down, quietly asking if he was neutral. Midoriya stared at 𝐒𝐬𝐬 with a dazed expression and admitted that he was, but insisted that 𝐒𝐬𝐬 couldn't tell anyone. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 smiled a little and assured Midoriya that he could rest and wouldn't have to go to school the next day. He tucked the teen into bed, and Midoriya made him promise to keep his secret. The next day, already in the afternoon, Midoriya woke up from the slight pain in his arm. He wandered downstairs to the kitchen in search of food but noticed a note next to a small stack of money on the counter. It was from 𝐒𝐬𝐬, informing him that he and Hisashi had work at UA, encouraging Midoriya to rest and use the money to order food. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 would return home around 1:30 and told Midoriya to call if he needed anything. Midoriya checked his phone and saw that it was all ready. He decided to go back upstairs for a nap but froze as memories of the previous night flooded back. He recalled feeling drugged and delirious, remembering exactly what he had said to 𝐒𝐬𝐬. Aimlessly, he wandered around the house, unsure of what to do. Eventually, he crawled back into bed and pulled the covers over himself, deciding that he couldn't talk to 𝐒𝐬𝐬 logically if he acted irrationally. He resolved to sleep for the rest of the day and pretend to be still under the influence of the medication when he woke. Suddenly, the door to his room burst open, and Aizawa entered with a shopping bag in hand. He asked if he had woken Midoriya, who quickly shook his head, internally panicking at Aizawa's early return. Aizawa mentioned he had bought food and asked if Midoriya was hungry. When Midoriya shook his head, Aizawa glared at him, questioning when he had last eaten. Midoriya mumbled that it had been breakfast the day before. Aizawa tossed the bag onto Midoriya's bed, insisting that he eat. Midoriya flinched but nodded slightly, opening the bag to find sushi. Aizawa then asked if they could talk, and Midoriya nodded again. Aizawa sat at the end of the bed and reminded Midoriya that he had told him he was neutral. Midoriya whispered that he would leave, believing Aizawa wouldn't want to foster someone like him. Aizawa, confused, tilted his head. Midoriya's eyes appeared lifeless and dull as he glanced up at Aizawa. In response, Aizawa pulled Midoriya into a tight hug, reassuring him that he wasn't mad and that he had suspected a connection between Midoriya and Neutral all along. Midoriya sighed quietly and asked if Aizawa would hurt him. Aizawa smiled and assured him that he wouldn't, adding that he needed to know if Midoriya was safe when he went out. Curious, Aizawa asked how Midoriya had become so strong. Midoriya smiled and explained that he didn't let his quirk dictate how he used it. Instead, he controlled it. He demonstrated by using his mind to bring a cup to his hand. He elaborated that he believed his quirk was the movement of small objects, which he referred to as telekinesis, but it could be more than that. Aizawa listened intently, fascinated by Midoriya's explanation. Midoriya continued, demonstrating how he could manipulate air and liquids, showcasing his abilities. He shared insights about how to use quirks in unconventional ways, encouraging Aizawa to consider new methods for his own abilities. Midoriya then proposed teaching Aizawa's class his way of thinking, suggesting that it might prevent him from having to confront the heroes he found frustrating. Aizawa responded with a bemused comment about 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐃, but he was intrigued by Midoriya's ideas. Not if Midoriya did it for free, as a hobby. After all, he was a villain, why should he care about 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐃? He pouted, and Aizawa retorted that he wasn't a villain but rather a problem child. Midoriya insisted they go talk to the principal, grabbing Aizawa's arm and throwing him out the window before jumping after him. As they soared through the air, Midoriya dragged Aizawa along. Aizawa snapped at him, pointing out that he was injured and clung to Midoriya, frightened by the height. Midoriya reassured him, mentioning how the doctor's healing quirk had helped him. He began to unravel the bandage on his arm. Aizawa demanded to be put down, but Midoriya flew quickly through the sky, stopping in front of UA and releasing his quirk. Aizawa let out a relieved sigh, trembling as he insisted Midoriya should never do that again. Midoriya smiled and pushed Aizawa through the entrance, allowing him to pass security. They walked through the school, with Aizawa leading Midoriya to the principal's office, where he knocked on the door. A voice called them in, and Aizawa opened the door, stepping inside with Midoriya following. Nizu, the principal, spun around in his chair, greeting them. Midoriya glared, stating that he was not little, as Nizu was smaller than him. Aizawa, feeling tired, slumped into a chair and urged Nizu to speed things up so he could go to sleep. Midoriya proposed teaching the aspiring heroes so they wouldn't turn out pathetic. Nizu, sipping his tea, asked how he intended to do that. Midoriya confidently stated that he was neutral. Aizawa, shocked, spat out his tea and stared at Midoriya. Nizu smiled and agreed to the deal, shaking Midoriya's hand, which left Aizawa bewildered. Nizu explained that he had a hunch about Midoriya's neutrality and enjoyed changing the minds of young villains with potential. Nizu pointed out that Midoriya was already stronger than most first and second years, possibly even the majority of the third years. He handed Midoriya a cup of tea, which Midoriya suspiciously questioned, wondering if it was poisoned. Nizu assured him it wasn't. Midoriya discreetly pulled out a small bottle and added a drop of liquid to the cup, causing Aizawa to react in alarm. Nizu continued, stating that he would contact Midoriya's school, allowing him to attend only on Wednesdays and Fridays, while he could work at UA on other days. He also mentioned that part of the deal required Midoriya to take the UA entrance exam after finishing middle school. Midoriya agreed, sipping the tea. Aizawa attempted to grab the cup from him, but Midoriya vanished from sight. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 spoke on the phone, confirming Midoriya's arrangement to work at UA. Izuku turned to find Midoriya standing by the wall, still drinking the tea. Izuku quietly scolded him not to drink it, but Midoriya smiled, asserting his independence. After 𝐒𝐮𝐬 hung up, Midoriya threw the empty cup into the air, where it landed neatly on 𝐒𝐮𝐬's desk. He then dragged Izuku out of the office, and they walked down the long corridor. Izuku stopped in front of the staff room, suggesting they leave with Hisashi. He kicked the door open, and all the heroes turned to glare at them, as if they already knew who was standing by the broken door. Midoriya poked his head inside, mentioning that he had fought all of them before. Izuku warned Midoriya that he was blowing his cover, but Midoriya shrugged, explaining that he was sparing himself the trouble of explaining later. He spotted Hisashi and called out to him. Hisashi approached, surprised to see Midoriya and asking what he was doing there. Midoriya casually mentioned getting a job, which astonished Hisashi, who questioned if he was too young. Midoriya proudly revealed that he had secured a position at UA. The heroes reacted by activating their quirks, and cement walls shot up around Midoriya, trapping him. However, he wasn't alone. Pro-hero ectoplasm was there, beginning to clone himself. Midoriya heard Izuku yelling outside the barrier, urging him not to get distracted. Ectoplasm advised him to stay focused. Midoriya smiled and clenched his fist, causing the clones to compress. Only the real ectoplasm screamed as Midoriya released him from his quirk, eliminating the clones. As the cement walls disappeared, Midoriya glanced back into the staff room, noticing that most of the pro-heroes had fallen asleep, a violet gas wafting through the air. He held his breath and quietly entered the staff room, only to be restrained by Midnight's 𝗟𝗶𝐻𝐸. Midoriya casually gathered the violet gas into a small ball and sent it flying out the window, inhaling sharply before grinning at Midnight. He proposed they have a chat, noting how easy it was for him to defeat her. Midnight sighed and released him from the WHP. Midoriya took a seat on a desk, stating that he would be working at UA on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. He claimed to have a unique training method that would prevent UA from producing ineffective heroes. He asked if there were any questions, prompting Midnight to inquire why he revealed his identity. Midoriya mumbled about not wanting to face future challenges, especially after a villain had exposed his identity to Izuku. Midnight thought for a moment before suggesting that he should get his hero provisional license. Midoriya was confused and asked why. Midnight explained that he was strong enough, and having the license would prevent him from being chased by the police when he defeated villains. Midoriya expressed concern about attacking heroes, which was already against the law. Midnight reassured him that as a minor, he would be treated differently than adults. When Midoriya questioned if he was too young, Midnight revealed that the exam was the next day and encouraged him to take it. Midoriya hesitated, mentioning he needed to ask Izuku, who was currently unconscious. Midnight approached Izuku and nudged him awake. Izuku sat up quickly, glaring at Midnight and commenting on how he could feel his life shortening. Midoriya informed Izuku about his plan to take the hero provisional license exam, and Izuku, after a moment, agreed it was a good idea. However, he quickly became concerned about Midoriya's well-being, recalling the earlier attack. Midoriya assured him he was fine, despite his broken arm. They decided to leave, and Izuku picked up Hisashi while Midoriya slid open the window. Izuku firmly stated they wouldn't be flying, but Midoriya jumped out anyway, soaring towards the forest. He landed by a river, where the dense trees cast shadows, making it quite dark. As he wandered through the muddy forest, he spotted a small child crying by a rock. Midoriya approached the child, who looked up with wide, frightened eyes. He crouched down and smiled, asking if the child was lost. The child nodded, and Midoriya offered his hand, promising to take him home. The boy was curious about how Midoriya found him, and Midoriya explained he used his quirk to search the forest, where kids often got lost. When asked where he lived, the boy simply replied at home. Midoriya then asked if he could look at the boy's memories to find his home, and the child agreed. Midoriya gently placed his hand on the boy's head and closed his eyes, allowing the memories to flow into him. After a moment, he opened his eyes and smiled, stating he now knew where to take him. The boy eagerly asked if Midoriya was a hero, to which Midoriya replied that he was too young but could fly. The boy jumped with excitement at the prospect of flying home. Midoriya lifted him into the air, and they soared towards the suburbs, landing in front of a small family house. Midoriya knocked on the door, and the boy joyfully exclaimed that Midoriya had found his home. A young woman opened the door, and upon seeing her son, she rushed to him. The boy excitedly recounted how he had gotten lost in the forest and how Midoriya had helped him. The mother expressed her gratitude, explaining she had been worried and had even called the police. Midoriya reassured her that it was common for kids to get lost in that forest. She invited him in for tea as a thank you, but Midoriya politely declined, stating he needed to get home. After exchanging goodbyes, he launched himself into the air and headed back. When he arrived, Izuku and Hisashi were not home yet, so he settled on the couch to watch TV until they returned. When they finally arrived, Izuku rushed over to Midoriya, scolding him for flying home because it was dangerous. Midoriya explained he had something to take care of, revealing that he had helped a lost child find his way home. Izuku listened, surprised by the revelation. Hisashi then excitedly exclaimed about Midoriya's control over his quirk, while Izuku retreated to the kitchen to prepare dinner. As they enjoyed a nice meal together while watching a movie, the evening wore on. Later, Midoriya was in his room changing into his pajamas when Izuku knocked softly on the door. Midoriya invited him in and Izuku shared that he and Midnight had arranged for Midoriya to take the provisional hero license exam the next day. Midoriya agreed, and Izuku informed him that Midnight would accompany him since it was her homeroom. Izuku then pointed out that Midoriya didn't have a hero costume and asked what he wanted to wear. Midoriya inquired if he could wear his normal costume, but Izuku explained that Nizu wanted to keep his identity private due to his age. Midoriya suggested wearing a UA sports uniform instead, which Izuku thought was a good idea. They planned to get one in the morning. The next day, Midoriya and Izuku walked through the large school, with Midoriya examining the UA sports uniform in his hands. He marveled at how soft it was. Izuku, slightly irritated, questioned why they had to arrive so early. Midoriya explained that teachers needed to be early to ensure students were trained properly. Izuku snapped back, asking what that was supposed to mean. Midoriya simply smiled, and Izuku pushed him into the bathroom, telling him to get changed while he waited outside. Midoriya entered a stall and changed into the uniform, which fit perfectly. As he looked down at his arms, he noticed the scars that marked his skin, realizing he didn't have any bandages. He bit his lip as he contemplated his next move, ultimately deciding to disregard the comments of others. Stepping out of the stall, he looked at himself in the mirror, recalling all the times his father had told him he could never become a hero. He brushed his green bangs over his blind eye to conceal it and walked back out to Izuku. Izuku remarked that he had taken so long that he thought he had drowned in the toilet. Midoriya pouted, threatening to drown Izuku instead, and began walking down the hallway with Izuku following closely behind. Izuku inquired why Midoriya was covering his eye, to which Midoriya replied that he didn't have his mask to hide it. Izuku sighed and gave Midoriya a reassuring pat on the shoulder, telling him to text if he needed anything. They stopped in front of a classroom, and Izuku informed him that Midnight would take care of him. Midoriya nodded and opened the classroom door. Midnight was at the front, engaging with the students. She turned to Midoriya and smiled, introducing him to the class and asking them to take care of him for the day. The class responded enthusiastically, and Midnight instructed everyone to change into their hero costumes as they would head to the venue immediately. The students rushed out of the classroom, and Midnight pulled Midoriya into a tight hug, expressing her longing to spend time with younger people like him. Midoriya, feeling a bit annoyed, pointed out that he was also a teenager. Midnight giggled, calling him young and small, which prompted Midoriya to coldly announce his irritation. Midnight released him, playfully lamenting that he was no fun, and suggested they head to the bus. They walked out of the building toward the bus, where Midoriya took a seat at the front and waited for the other students. Soon, they began piling onto the bus, and after Midnight called attendance, they set off. The students were lively during the ride, which Midoriya found somewhat bothersome. Inside the gymnasium, around 1,500 students gathered, waiting for the announcer to speak. A man at the podium tapped the microphone to gain everyone's attention and explained the rules of the exam. Examinees were required to place 3 targets on their bodies in any exposed area. The targets would recognize the ball thrown at them and determine who hit whom based on various factors. Students would receive a box with 6 orange balls, and if all 3 targets were hit, that student would be eliminated. To pass the first phase, competitors needed to eliminate 2 others, with only the first 100 applicants advancing to the final phase. Everyone hurried to collect their ball and targets before rushing out to the stadium. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 𝐃𝐞𝐭𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐬 dragged Midoriya to join the rest of the class so they could work together. The announcer sounded the alarm, signaling the start of the exam. A rival class jumped out from behind beams, preparing to attack the UA students. Midoriya held out his hand, freezing them midair, leaving the majority of Class 1A stunned by the sudden turn of events. 2 of the floating students descended toward Midoriya, and he threw his orange ball at their targets, successfully eliminating 1. The announcer confirmed that 1 student had passed the exam. Midoriya then dispatched the remaining students from the ambushing class, giving Class 1A the opportunity to defeat them. He flew to the waiting room for those who had passed, being the first to arrive. Sitting quietly in a corner, he waited as some UA students and a few from other schools entered. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 spotted Midoriya and rushed over, excitedly praising him for his impressive performance. Midoriya, slightly bashful, downplayed his contribution, but 𝐒𝐮𝐬 insisted that half of their class had already finished. Midoriya acknowledged the talent of UA students, and 𝐒𝐮𝐬 expressed curiosity about Midoriya's powerful quirk, asking how he had received a recommendation for the hero provisional license. Midoriya explained that 𝐒𝐮𝐬 was fostering him and that he had managed to impress 𝐒𝐮𝐬. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 was amazed by this revelation, and Midoriya stood up, brushing himself off as 𝐒𝐮𝐬 commented on his small stature. Midoriya retorted that he was still growing. Before long, the exam concluded, and everyone from UA had passed. The second part of the exam commenced, requiring students to rescue citizens from a damaged building and assist them with their injuries. Midoriya diligently moved back and forth, helping people to safety. However, as he made his way toward the building, he noticed large chunks of rubble beginning to fall. Some students were walking with citizens, oblivious to the danger. Midoriya muttered that there shouldn't be loose rubble. He raised his hand, freezing the debris in midair before gently lowering it to the ground. He then levitated himself to the top of the building, where he encountered a villain, a massive, muscular figure with an unusual extension from his shoulders. Midoriya addressed the villain, noting that he had come uninvited. The villain, surprised by Midoriya's presence, smirked and taunted him. Midoriya prepared to use his power but hesitated, remembering the exam's rules. The villain, frustrated, hurled a large piece of rubble at Midoriya, who swiftly redirected it, turning it into dust. The sirens blared, announcing the presence of an intruder and identifying the villain as 𝗟𝗶𝗸. The speakers urged everyone to evacuate. Midoriya sighed, realizing the situation was becoming troublesome. The villain struck the building with tremendous force, causing it to crumble further. Midoriya quickly sent out a wave of his telekinesis, sensing any trapped citizens. Wherever he detected someone, he flew them out of the collapsing structure. Some students from Class 1A, who had not yet evacuated, began to assist the floating citizens, prompting Midoriya to release his quirk. The villain grabbed Midoriya's arm while he was concentrating and threw him off the building. The villain jumped down, landing safely on the ground. Midoriya crashed into the earth, still focused on protecting the actors in his mind, unaware that he was no longer on the building. The villain taunted him, saying he was using his quirk too much and that it bored him. He threatened to keep Midoriya captive before ending. Grabbing Midoriya by the hair, the villain provoked him, claiming it was too late for a fight. He slammed Midoriya's head against the ground, mocking him for taking too long to worry about the actors. Pro heroes began to gather in the arena, but their presence frightened Midoriya. He believed he was neutral and feared they would attack him. Unable to see anything with his head pressed into the dirt, panic set in. He released his quirk, freezing everyone around him and sending the villain flying into the rubble of the building. Midoriya jumped up and surveyed the scene, his vision tinted red from the BLD running down his face. He glared at the villain, who retaliated by throwing a piece of rubble at him. Just before Midoriya could react, Pro Hero Gang Orca jumped in front of him and caught the debris. With ringing ears and a pounding head, Midoriya felt overwhelmed by fear of the heroes, so he covered his eyes. He sent out a wave of telekinesis to stay aware of his surroundings and sensed an actor trapped under the rubble. Ignoring Gang Orca's warning to evacuate, Midoriya focused on rescuing the civilian actor. The villain continued to throw rubble while laughing maniacally. Midoriya froze the debris mid-air and sent it flying back at the villain, using his quirk to free the actor. He dug through the rubble and eventually pulled the unconscious actor out, BLD pooling beneath him. Lifting the actor with his quirk, Midoriya examined his wounds. The actor's head appeared unharmed, but one arm was severely injured. Hearing sirens, Midoriya turned, thinking the police had come for him, but they were arresting the villain, indifferent to his injuries. An ambulance arrived, and a paramedic jumped out. After assessing the actor, the paramedic noted a concussion but no head injuries, advising Midoriya to rest. Midoriya insisted he didn't need help, but Gang Orca placed a hand on his shoulder, affirming that he did. He praised Midoriya for his bravery, which made the boy wipe the BLD from his face and sigh, claiming he was fine. Gang Orca, however, picked Midoriya up and carried him toward the ambulance, ignoring his protests. As Midoriya squirmed and complained about being called little, Gang Orca laughed and placed him on the bed in the van. The hero closed the door behind him, leaving Midoriya to receive treatment from the paramedic. At the hospital, Midoriya underwent a full-body X-ray, revealing multiple broken bones, including cracked ribs and a linear skull fracture. Midnight received a stern lecture from Izuku for not taking better care of Midoriya. The doctor treated his injuries but could only partially heal his hand because Midoriya passed out from exhaustion. The doctor explained that Midoriya's energy had been drained and that he needed to rest in the hospital for further recovery. Midoriya lay in the hospital bed, irritation etched on his face. He despised hospitals and wanted to leave as soon as possible. With Izuku gone to collect card games, Midoriya was left with nurses who checked on him every 30 minutes. As night fell, he longed for sleep but remained distrustful of the hospital. Suddenly, the window flew open, and Midoriya glanced over to see Stain sitting on the ledge. Stain teased him about getting beaten up again, to which Midoriya growled that he was fine. Stain pointed out the machines connected to him, and Midoriya explained they were monitoring him for any serious conditions. The two boys chatted for a while, and Stain offered a special massage to alleviate Midoriya's pain. Izuku entered, glaring at Stain and ordering him to leave. Midoriya defended Stain, saying he was just keeping him company. Stain ruffled Midoriya's hair before standing up and saying he would leave, wishing Midoriya to rest. Izuku then asked if Stain had hurt him. Midoriya explained that Stain had helped him in the past, acting as a guardian and teaching him essential life skills. Izuku sat a pile of cards on Midoriya's bed, commenting on how often they seemed to be in the hospital. Midoriya agreed, sighing in response. Izuku playfully suggested that Midoriya should stop being reckless to avoid injuries. Midoriya reflected on the weight of his actions, realizing that if he hadn't acted, many lives would have been lost. Izuku acknowledged this with a smirk, suggesting that Midoriya was like a hero. Midoriya, however, firmly disagreed, which only brought a smile to Izuku's face. They spent the next few hours engaged in card games and conversation. Once Midoriya felt sufficiently rested, the doctor who specialized in bone healing attended to his last injury, and he was finally discharged from the hospital. Although he wished to fly home, Izuku insisted on driving them back. As they traveled, Midoriya succumbed to sleep, the late hour taking its toll. Upon arriving home, Izuku gently shook him awake. Midoriya startled and quickly turned to Izuku, who calmly informed him that they were home. After a moment of adjustment, Midoriya exited the car. Inside the house, it was dark and quiet. Midoriya inquired about Mick's whereabouts, to which Izuku replied that he likely had gone to bed. Midoriya began to ascend the stairs when Izuku called out to him, prompting Midoriya to pause and glance back. Aizawa's tone was sincere as he asked if Midoriya was okay. Midoriya assured him that he was fine, thanks to the doctor's care. However, Aizawa pressed further, concerned about Midoriya's mental state. He wanted to know if Midoriya was coping with his past traumas. Midoriya, slightly confused, confirmed that his brain was functioning well and that he had no serious issues. Aizawa clarified that he was referring to the emotional scars from Midoriya's past, including his father and previous foster parents. Midoriya noticed a shadow by the stairs, accompanied by other faint illusions. He insisted that he could manage, but Aizawa's gaze followed Midoriya's, trying to discern what he was seeing. The shadow taunted Midoriya, but he reassured Aizawa that it was gone, attributing its departure to Aizawa's presence. He mentioned that if he truly wanted to rid himself of such visions, he would take the medication Stain had provided. Curious, Aizawa asked about the medication. Midoriya explained that it helped silence the voices. As he crawled into bed, he agreed to Aizawa's request to visit Stain in the morning. Aizawa quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. The following morning, Aizawa and Midoriya made their way to the underground villain base. Midoriya expressed his surprise at Aizawa's insistence on bringing him along, claiming he had been under the influence of medication the night before. Aizawa reminded him that he had indeed agreed to it. Upon entering the underground store, the shop owner looked puzzled at the sight of a hero accompanying Midoriya. They proceeded to the staff room, where Stain was preparing breakfast. Stain's initial reaction was one of irritation at Midoriya's presence, but Aizawa quickly explained the situation, emphasizing its importance. Stain instructed Midoriya to help clean the shop, noting that Kenta had injured himself. As Midoriya left the staff room, Aizawa inquired about Midoriya's hallucinations and the medication he received from Stain. Stain elaborated on Midoriya's condition, explaining that he struggled with severe bipolar disorder, leading to vivid hallucinations that had become like imaginary friends to him. Aizawa learned that Midoriya had not been taking his medication, which alarmed both him and Stain. Discussed the need for Midoriya to see a doctor, but Stain pointed out that Midoriya would only trust the doctor he had seen before. Stain offered to arrange for the doctor to come to the base, making it clear that Aizawa's presence would need to be communicated to avoid any misunderstandings. After their conversation, Aizawa left the room to find Midoriya, who was communicating with the shop owner using sign language. Aizawa called for Midoriya to join him, and as they exited he asked about the mask Midoriya wore. Midoriya dismissed the question, and they continued on their way. Suddenly, Midoriya halted in an alleyway, sensing a villain nearby. A villain emerged from the shadows, launching an attack on Midoriya. In a swift motion, Midoriya caught the villain's fist, causing the attacker to cry out in pain before he released his grip and continued walking. Aizawa restrained the villain, commenting on Midoriya's apparent harmlessness, but he was cautious nonetheless. The villain, undeterred, drew a dagger and hurled it at Midoriya. Without breaking stride, Midoriya caught the dagger effortlessly, mocking the villain's aim. He prepared to retaliate, but Aizawa intervened, reminding him that there was no need for violence. With time running short, Aizawa urged Midoriya to hurry, and they made their way towards the school. Midoriya suggested flying, but Aizawa vehemently refused, leading to a playful exchange as Midoriya took to the air, eliciting a startled response from Aizawa. Midoriya chuckled, unable to hear Aizawa over the rush of wind as they flew toward the school. He landed quickly and made his way to the entrance. Aizawa leaned against the wall for support, trying to catch his breath. Midoriya playfully teased him, calling him a big baby, and dashed inside. Aizawa hurried after him, declaring he would ground him. Midoriya retorted that Aizawa wasn't his dad, sticking his tongue out before sprinting toward the staff room. Inside, Hisashi stood with a coffee in hand, noting that they had taken longer than expected to arrive. Midoriya explained that he had to change and that Aizawa had been busy discussing him with Stain. Aizawa defended himself, insisting their conversation was important. Hisashi handed Midoriya a clipboard containing the day's schedule, which Midoriya scanned while Aizawa prepared his 50th cup of coffee. Midoriya complained about Aizawa's constant presence, to which Aizawa questioned why he had to babysit him. Hisashi chimed in, suggesting it was because Midoriya might cause trouble and Aizawa had no classes to teach. Midoriya pouted as the bell rang, and he grabbed Aizawa's arm, dragging him through the school despite Aizawa's protests about his coffee. They entered a classroom where the homeroom teacher was distributing licenses to the students. The teacher explained that due to a recent villain incident, they hadn't been able to receive their licenses directly, but they had all passed. The students cheered, and the teacher looked at Midoriya and Aizawa with surprise. Midoriya smiled, while Aizawa pulled the teacher aside to discuss the presence of a wanted criminal in the school. Midoriya introduced himself to the class, explaining that he would be teaching a few classes to help them reach their potential. He noted that their classes would differ from others. Just then, Tomoko, or Redhead, threw a knife at him, which he narrowly avoided as it embedded itself in the wall. Midoriya remarked on her anger issues, and the class glared at her. He continued explaining the importance of training their quirks to act in unconventional ways. He encouraged Tamaki to consider how he could manipulate his quirk creatively, suggesting he could protect himself by consuming non-living objects. Midoriya emphasized the need for focus and practice, assuring the students that hard work would lead to significant improvement. The class spent the remainder of the time discussing their quirks in groups, presenting their ideas to Midoriya, who offered additional insights. As the day progressed, Midoriya repeated this process, while Aizawa took the opportunity to rest in his sleeping bag. After school, Midoriya and Aizawa walked toward the underground store in silence. Aizawa inquired about Midoriya's thoughts on the students, to which Midoriya responded that some had potential while others were overly confident. Aizawa smiled at this observation. As they entered the staff room, Midoriya suddenly froze, sensing an unsettling presence. Aizawa asked if he was bothering Stain again. The lights flickered off, and Midoriya attempted to flee but was tripped. A strange voice echoed in the darkness, taunting him. Aizawa turned the lights back on, revealing a short man with an unsettling grin, his hair a chaotic mix of black and white, and his eyes a striking yellow and red. Midoriya demanded to know who had invited him, and the man responded with a chuckle, mentioning Stain and Aizawa. Midoriya glared at Aizawa, who seemed unfazed. The man commented on how much Midoriya had grown since their last encounter, prompting Midoriya to kick him off and stand up, proudly noting his height. The man pouted, and as Midoriya changed into his usual attire, the stranger inquired about his medication. Midoriya firmly told him to leave him alone. The man smirked, suggesting they wouldn't want to resort to using his quirk. Midoriya slammed his locker shut, insisting he didn't need it. Aizawa stood in front of the door, advising Midoriya to listen to his doctors. The man approached Midoriya, placing a hand on his shoulder and expressing his longing to adjust Midoriya's mental health care plan. Midoriya snapped at him, refusing. The man insisted that his plans were enjoyable and forcibly guided Midoriya to a chair, examining him closely. He asked if Midoriya had undergone surgery on his eye, to which Midoriya replied that it was something he didn't want. When the man touched his eyelid, Midoriya reacted defensively, covering his eye and demanding not to be touched. The man remarked on Midoriya's reaction, and Midoriya stood up, determined to leave. However, he found himself unable to move as the man commanded him to sit back down. Midoriya complied, appearing dazed. The man turned his attention to Aizawa, demanding he leave, claiming this was a matter between him and Midoriya. Aizawa hesitated, concerned for Midoriya's safety, but eventually stepped outside. The man smiled at Midoriya, asking if he had been cutting recently. Midoriya monotonously confirmed that he had. "Has your little shadow friend been around? Has he told you to do bad things?" The doctor smiled and snapped his fingers. Midoriya blinked, then glared at the man in front of him. "Is he here now?" the doctor asked. Midoriya snapped back, acknowledging the obvious. "He doesn't come out when I'm angry and talking to someone. Think harder, look around, is he here?" The doctor smirked. Midoriya scanned the room. He looked back toward the doctor and froze. The shadow stood behind the doctor, holding a knife. "We don't like this man, Izuku. Let's get rid of him," the shadow whispered. Midoriya growled at the shadow, his presence becoming thick and intimidating. "You're feeling hopeless?" the doctor inquired. Midoriya flinched, meeting the doctor's gaze. And you're not? Who would want to live in this world? He ripped a dagger from his belt and threw it past the doctor's head. It flew right through the shadow, causing it to vanish. The majority of the world enjoys living, Izuku, the doctor remarked with a smile. Midoriya stood up and walked over to retrieve his dagger. That's foolish, he mumbled. So, what did your shadowy friend say? The doctor asked. He said we don't like you and we should get rid of you, Midoriya pouted. I see. Well, at least you know how to manage him now, the doctor thought, recalling past events with Midoriya, sending a shiver down his spine. Let's do a general checkup while I'm here, the doctor said, picking up Midoriya. You've gained weight, that's good. He dropped the teen and jotted down notes on a clipboard. You haven't seen me for 3 years. Of course, I've gained weight, idiot. Midoriya snapped. I see. The doctor mumbled as he checked Midoriya's other measurements. Are you even listening to what I'm saying? Midoriya asked. Yup. Are you eating 3 meals a day? The doctor inquired. Can I go now? Midoriya asked. I'll give you a prescription for medication, the doctor replied, scribbling on a sheet. I'm not taking it, Midoriya mumbled. I'll have your hero make you take it. The doctor handed him a prescription, which Midoriya promptly ripped up. The doctor glared at Midoriya, then opened the door to the room. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 was sitting by the counter, helping the shop owner count money. Hero, get him this medication, the doctor snapped, handing another prescription to 𝐒𝐮𝐬. Midoriya snatched the prescription from 𝐒𝐮𝐬's hand and tore it apart. The shop owner, Kenta, activated his quirk, causing Midoriya to collapse to the ground. Thank you, Kenta, the doctor said, handing another prescription to 𝐒𝐮𝐬. For the green box, 1 in the morning, 1 in the middle of the day, and 2 from the other box when he eats dinner. All right. Also, is he all right? 𝐒𝐮𝐬 pointed at Midoriya. Kenta can paralyze people when he looks at them, but when he blinks, it is disabled. He is related to Stain, the doctor explained, slipping his pen into his coat and smiling. I see. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 mumbled. I'll be back in a month to check on the medication, the doctor waved, then hurried out of the shop. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 looked toward Kenta. When I blink, my quirk stops too. Kenta smiled and nodded, then blinked. Midoriya sat up and glared at Kenta, signing that he would take action against him. Kenta gasped and quickly signed back that it wasn't very nice and that he was helping. Stop bothering him. Let's go get your medication, 𝐒𝐮𝐬 mumbled. The teen pouted. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 grabbed his hand and led him out of the base. The next day, Midoriya sat in his classroom with a frown. Even though he had missed almost the entire week of school, teachers and students still cared enough about the midterm results to praise him for achieving full marks. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 spent the whole day celebrating their shared position at the top. Midoriya had never met anyone else who received full marks, not to mention Momo Yaoyorozu, who also excelled. It was far too loud for him. Not only wouldn't 𝐒𝐮 stop talking, but the voices in his head were overwhelming. He had left home before 𝐒𝐮𝐬 could make him take the medication, but his developing headache was making him regret that decision. Eventually, the day ended, but Midoriya didn't want to go back home. 𝐒𝐮 approached him with a smile, inviting him to join him and Momo at a cafe. Midoriya stared at the taller teen for a moment, then nodded. All right. Great. There's a nice cafe nearby that we were thinking of visiting, 𝐒𝐮 beamed. Midoriya pulled out his phone and opened the group chat with 𝐒𝐮𝐬 and Hisashi. I'm going to a cafe with some classmates. Okay, 𝐒𝐮𝐬 replied. You already have a ℎ. Hisashi teased. I will take action against you, Midoriya typed back. Ready to go? 𝐒𝐮 asked. Yeah. Midoriya put his phone away. Momo approached the two boys with a smile. Let's go, she said as she walked off, and Midoriya and 𝐒𝐮 followed. They walked to a small cafe and ordered food. Midoriya sat at a table while waiting for his order, with 𝐒𝐮 and Momo joining him. Have you been unwell this week, Midoriya? 𝐒𝐮 asked. No. I've been working at UA, he explained. Momo and 𝐒𝐮 stared at him in surprise. What? They exclaimed. I got a job at UA on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. The principal appreciates my approach to using my quirk, so I am teaching it to the students, Midoriya elaborated. A waitress placed their food in front of them and left. I thought you were quirkless. Ida mentioned. I just don't flaunt my quirk, Midoriya replied, sipping his milkshake. What's your quirk then? Momo asked. Telekinesis, Midoriya smiled. Oh, so you can move things with your mind, Ida assessed. Well, that's what they say. But I've developed it further, Midoriya mumbled. What do you mean? Ida asked. Midoriya spent some time explaining how he uses his quirk. They both seemed fascinated and decided they would head off to train to use their quirks as Midoriya had described. After parting ways, Midoriya made his way home. The sun was already setting since it was winter, and it was getting quite cold outside. Midoriya used his quirk to manipulate the air around him, warming it up. He opened the door to his home, only to be tackled to the ground by Aizawa. Hello, little troublemaker, it's time to take your medication. Aizawa greeted. Midoriya gasped, realizing he had completely forgotten about it. That's right. You can't escape this time. Aizawa erased Midoriya's quirk before he could use it to flee and bound him with his hero equipment. Let go. Midoriya snapped. Aizawa dragged him down the hallway. Nope. Aizawa stood in the kitchen and held out 2 pills, releasing Midoriya from his scarf. Midoriya stared at the pills with a look of disgust. The shadow urged him to reject the medication, insisting he should take more drastic action instead. Midoriya glared at the shadow, then defiantly swallowed the pills without water. The shadow gasped, horrified by his choice. It demanded he throw it up or face dire consequences. Midoriya, undeterred, taunted the shadow, asserting that it couldn't do anything to him. A knife formed in the shadow's hand, and the atmosphere around Midoriya grew darker and more distorted. He flinched, recalling the last time he had experienced such a psychotic episode. Aizawa noticed Midoriya's startled expression and questioned him. A voice from somewhere in the room hissed that he had been poisoned, while another urged him to expel the pills. The shadow lunged at Midoriya, knife in hand, screaming for him to throw up the medication. Its face twisted into a terrifying form as it threatened him. Midoriya, in a moment of desperation, sent various objects flying towards the shadow, slowing its advance and causing it to stumble. Aizawa stepped closer, erasing Midoriya's quirk and reassuring him that it wasn't real. Midoriya looked at Aizawa, but his mentor's face appeared distorted and dark, which only added to his fear. Voices echoed in his mind, accusing him of being poisoned. The shadow loomed behind him, gripping his shoulders tightly and growling threats of violence. Midoriya, fueled by determination, shouted that the pills would take effect in 30 minutes, and the shadow would disappear. He shook off the shadow's grip and ran down the twisting hallway, colliding with the wall and falling to the floor. Aizawa rushed after him, pulling Midoriya into a tight embrace, urging him to ignore the voices and assuring him everything would be all right. Midoriya covered his head with his arms, managing to calm himself enough to dispel the hallucinations. The shadow, still menacing, glared down at him, dripping with a dark substance and accusing him of betrayal for trusting others. Despite the shadow's taunts, Midoriya remained still and resolute. Weeks had passed since Midoriya began working at UA and started his medication. He was beginning to act more like a typical teenager, his mind becoming more stable and controlled. His classes were going well, and his students were achieving outstanding results. He even shared his unique perspective with pro heroes, contributing to their growth. News articles circulated about the neutral figure at UA, highlighting his efforts to strengthen future heroes. The public, once skeptical, began to appreciate his contributions. However, his patrols remained intense. He would confront heroes he deemed unworthy and deal with villains who provoked him. Aizawa and Mike often accompanied him, ensuring he didn't cross any lines, sometimes resorting to bribery to keep him in check. Merchandise featuring him quickly appeared in stores, garnering widespread popularity. This newfound fame, however, attracted more attention from frustrated villains. Midoriya found himself under attack more frequently, even while walking to work with Aizawa. Despite the challenges, Midoriya easily defended himself against the villains, finding their attempts more annoying than threatening. One evening, Midoriya sat on the edge of a tall building, sipping a juice box while observing a fight below. Aizawa had stepped away to fetch sandwiches, instructing him to stay put. The cold night air made it a quiet evening, prompting him to remove his mask for better visibility. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 soon returned, handing him a sandwich, which he gratefully accepted. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 remarked on the rarity of Midoriya taking off his mask, to which Midoriya replied that it was too dark for anyone to see his eyes. They shared a moment of silence, watching as the police dealt with the defeated villains. Midoriya scoffed, expressing his frustration at the weakness of some villains, suggesting they should train harder before engaging in battles. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 teased him, reminding him that not everyone possessed his level of talent. Midoriya reflected on his past struggles, acknowledging that he had to grow stronger to confront his fears. He then donned his mask again and leaped off the building. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 scolded him for his reckless behavior as he followed, landing safely beside him. Midoriya declared his longing for ice cream, reminding 𝐒𝐮𝐬 of their promise that if he refrained from violence, they would treat themselves. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 playfully called him a big baby, prompting a light-hearted warning from Midoriya. They made their way back to the base for Midoriya to change before heading to their favorite ice cream shop. The staff recognized them, having become regulars. They enjoyed their ice cream while walking home, despite the chilly night. Midoriya paused at the edge of the forest, sensing something unsettling within the trees. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 inquired about his sudden stillness, and Midoriya explained that he sensed a disturbing presence nearby. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and felt a rush of wind. He pinpointed the source of the disturbance by the river, sensing both a large and small presence. Grabbing 𝐒𝐮𝐬's arm, he launched into the air, soaring through the forest. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 protested, reminding Midoriya of his dislike for flying, but Midoriya reassured him that he would be safe. They landed on a tree, positioned perfectly to observe the scene unfolding by the river. There, a small child was held captive by a grown man, blue lights swirling around them like a tornado, primarily emanating from the child. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 slipped out of the tree quietly and stealthily hid in the shadows. Midoriya froze the hero's body and glared at him, then shook his head. The small child fell limp in the man's arms, and the lights faded away. The man tossed the child into the river, then disappeared. Midoriya growled, recognizing the danger. He released 𝐒𝐮𝐬 from his quirk. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 mumbled about how he could have saved that kid, but Midoriya countered that he was too weak. He explained that the man had a dangerous quirk that allowed him to absorb anything from a living thing he touched. Midoriya had been watching him for a while, always managing to save the children before the man could reach them. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 questioned why he hadn't heard of this threat before, and Midoriya explained that the man operated in secrecy, luring people with quirks into the forest to take them. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 realized the gravity of the situation, acknowledging that the man was likely much stronger than he was. Midoriya, trying to lighten the mood, compared 𝐒𝐮𝐬's strength to that of an ant compared to a dinosaur. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 snapped back, and they engaged in a playful sparring match. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 launched a fist at Midoriya, who ducked and flipped him to the ground. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 quickly recovered and disappeared from Midoriya's view, attempting to trip him. Midoriya flipped back onto his feet and captured 𝐒𝐮𝐬's arm, pulling it behind his back. Midoriya complimented 𝐒𝐮𝐬's impressive moves, unaware that he had been bound by 𝐒𝐮𝐬's capture gear. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 secured him to a tree branch, teasing him about his training. Before Midoriya could activate his quirk, 𝐒𝐮𝐬 erased it. However, Midoriya managed to slice through the capture gear with a dagger and landed safely on the ground. In a playful challenge, Midoriya declared that the last one home would cook for the next month. He used his quirk to stitch 𝐒𝐮𝐬's gear back together and sprinted toward the river, flying over it. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 erased his quirk, causing him to fall into the icy water. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 smirked as he swung across the river with his capture gear and ran quietly through the trees, trying to avoid detection. Midoriya, struggling in the cold water, sprinted through the forest, shedding his soaked clothes to lighten his load. As he felt his quirk return, he used it to run faster. However, as he approached 𝐒𝐮𝐬's house, he found himself bound by a white scarf. 𝐒𝐮𝐬, teasingly questioning who was stronger, swiftly ran past Midoriya and scaled the surrounding houses. Midoriya cut through the scarf with his dagger and used his telekinesis to throw 𝐒𝐮𝐬 off the building. After a series of playful sabotages, both boys collapsed in front of the house, out of breath and covered in scratches. Hisashi arrived just in time, grinning as he announced he had picked up pizza. Aizawa and Midoriya glared at him, but he shrugged it off and opened the door to the house. A year and a half passed, and things were going well for Midoriya. He had top scores at school and outstanding results at work. Aizawa had unknowingly taught him how normal people function, while Hisashi continued to manage their tempers. The family of three got along well. Despite Midoriya's reluctance about attending the UA entrance exam, he agreed to go. The students faced a written exam, which Midoriya found tedious, followed by a physical exam where they had to destroy robots worth different points. As soon as they were sent off into battle, Midoriya flew into the sky, gaining a bird's-eye view of the arena filled with tall buildings where the robots could hide. He sent out a shockwave of air to detect all the robots and lifted them into the air, watching as they shattered into pieces. He even destroyed the robot worth 0 points. The other students were confused, unable to find any robots. Aizawa erased Midoriya's quirk, causing him to fall to the ground, but he landed safely and smiled as he exited the fake city. Aizawa scolded him for leaving the others without robots to fight, but Midoriya shrugged it off, claiming it wasn't his problem. Aizawa explained that the round had started 30 seconds ago, and they had wasted time talking. Midoriya cheekily insisted that the others should have acted faster. Aizawa sighed, having expected this outcome. He mentioned that the students would get another chance because they were up against someone who wasn't human and had instructed Nizu to prepare double the robots. Midoriya rested his head in his hands, unimpressed. As soon as his quirk returned, knives flew toward Aizawa from all directions, but he caught them all and erased Midoriya's quirk again. Aizawa remarked that Midoriya had played that card too many times and was used to it. Midoriya then flicked a playing card at Aizawa, lodging it into his arm. Aizawa pulled it out, surprised at how Midoriya had done it. Midoriya chuckled, reminding Aizawa that one couldn't survive in this world with just one trick. Aizawa acknowledged that he remembered those days. As Midoriya playfully bowed, Aizawa reminded him that he wasn't allowed to patrol without him or Hisashi and instructed him to return to work since he had classes that afternoon. Midoriya scoffed at the idea of boring classes but made his way toward the school. For most students in Japan, there was just 1 week of summer break left. Some UA students attended optional summer classes, signing up to learn from Midoriya during their break. However, this meant Midoriya had to work while others enjoyed their time off. He kept his spare neutral costume in the staff lockers at UA, avoiding the need to return to his base to change. Hisashi rushed toward Midoriya, calling out his name with urgency. Midoriya, concerned, asked what was wrong. Hisashi explained that there had been an accident during the exam, and as teachers and heroes, they were unable to intervene. He turned to Midoriya, pleading for his help. Midoriya acknowledged that under severe circumstances, intervention was permitted. Hisashi reminded him that if they did intervene, everyone, including Midoriya, would have to retake the physical exam. Hisashi smiled, knowing Midoriya would prefer to avoid that. Reluctantly, Midoriya agreed and hurried with Hisashi to the arena. Upon reaching the city, he surveyed the chaos until he spotted the massive 0-point robot wreaking havoc, sending debris flying everywhere. His attention was drawn to a girl with brown hair trapped under a large piece of rubble. With a swift motion, he cleared the debris away from her. He dashed toward her to help her escape, but the robot swung its enormous fist in their direction. In a moment of determination, he raised his hand and shattered the robot into countless pieces. Crouching beside the girl, he extended his hand and asked if she could stand.